On that day, there were many dragons everywhere, and a real battle was raging. Madame Dark was there, accompanied by a large group of her fighters. Then someone promised her personally that they would definitely return after successfully completing the task. That terrible battle continued for a very long time. At that time, there was talk of a computer game called Beyond the Realm of Fantasy, set in a land of eternal peace where no one knows rest. An ordinary office worker named Kim Jun finally received the long-awaited news of a major update to his favorite game. All this happened in an age when technology and game quality were rapidly developing and were extremely popular among people all over the world. This era was called the era of virtual reality games and was in full swing, and our hero Kim Jun's favorite game, also known as ZGF, was no exception. However, among the variety of virtual games, Kim Jun's favorite game was not as popular. Many say that ZGF has a too realistic system, which increases the overall difficulty of the game. Another important fact is that in this game, it is impossible to level up your character with money. Kim Jun found all the disadvantages of this game extremely interesting and fascinating, which increased his interest in it every time he played. That is why he became completely and utterly immersed in this virtual game. That day, he couldn't wait to get home from work because it was the day ZGF would receive its first major update in 3 years. It was 7 o'clock in the evening and the update would be downloaded at midnight, so Kim Jun had 5 hours left to play. Then he thought that he needed to prepare himself before the game update. He turned on all his equipment and got ready to connect to virtual reality. When he successfully logged in, he was asked to choose the character he planned to play today. Kim Jun knew that those who had 3 characters leveled up to the maximum level were called no-lifers. But our hero had 7 such characters, all of whom were at the highest possible level. That day, he decided to settle on another hero who caught his eye among the wide variety of characters available. The chosen character was Dio, who was at level 10 with no class. Kim Jun always used the character Dio as a kind of storage space, and he was created solely for the purpose of storing all his things. And so, to continue playing, he immersed himself in the character Dio. Opening the menu, he saw that a new class had been added, and that he should collect items that would speed up leveling while he sorted everything. This character had 1,000 different items in his arsenal, and Kim Jun compared it to sorting a real warehouse. Then he realized that sorting all the items would take much longer than he had imagined. When he finished, he had to organize the warehouse in the settlement of Avera, where he was met by the warehouse manager named Tony. Since everything turned out to be more complicated than he thought, he needed time to figure it out and asked Tony to open the subspace. In response to his request to open this place, Tony asked him for a payment of 1 silver coin. In this game, the economy is structured so that the cost of payment depends on the character's level, which is why everyone has a similar level to the 10th level. Looking at his inventory, he was surprised to see a very strange item that he didn't even know he had in his arsenal. Reaching out, he took the dagger of Lycan from the warehouse and realized that he had to leave it in his inventory until he could give it to another character. He continued to be surprised by some things because he didn't understand why he kept a lot of useless junk in his warehouse. Then he heard an announcement that a global system update would begin in 15 minutes. All players were told that they needed to go to safe places and log out of their characters, but Kim Jun was sure that this was not necessary, as he believed that the system would automatically log him out of the game when the time came. He understood that even level 100 would be suitable for the settlement where he was currently located, but he would be completely safe until he left the main square. He wanted to organize everything and finish everything he had planned as quickly as possible, but the update would begin in 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, access to the game was closed and the system began to repeat the same message over and over again without stopping, as if it had broken down. Then, when Kim Jun heard the system say that he could no longer send messages, he realized that something was wrong, but he was glad that he had finally finished sorting through all his supplies. He began to stretch and realized that he shouldn't have stored so many items and left them unattended, because today he was quite tired from sorting. He looked at his hand and at first didn't understand what was happening, because he should have been disconnected from the game, but he was still in it. For a moment, he thought that the server check had been cancelled, because he hadn't even heard the notification. Then he thought he knew one sure solution because he remembered that he could log out manually and tried to call up the system. He stared at the menu and couldn't find the button that would allow him to return to reality. He noticed that the sensations of being in the game had become much more acute, and he was amazed to think that the developers had recreated the level of tactile perception to such an extent. He looked at his palms and realized that something was definitely wrong here. He remembered the existence of an interdimensional rift in the only place where you could play with other players and ran there. He ran there as fast as he could, hoping to find someone else who hadn't been able to escape the game and talk to them. But when he got there, he didn't see a single soul around, and his disappointment knew no bounds because there should have been a gate there. At that moment, a child ran past him, almost knocking him off his feet. But then he turned around and apologized with a smile on his face. After Kim Jun felt the pain from the collision with the child, he thought again about how everything felt extremely realistic, as if it were real life. When he realized that he was still in the game with no way to exit, he was convinced that he would sue the developers for this. He thought that it was probably due to an update and possible problems that had arisen as a result. 3 days later, he finally realized that the game had become his reality, and he was upset that he had chosen a low-level character. Meanwhile, training was taking place at the training ground, where the leader ordered the others to prepare their weapons and not forget their battle cry. Kim Jun in Dio's body watched as he said that they would not be able to protect their settlement if they continued in the same vein. For the first 3 days, he denied the fact that he couldn't get out of this game, but he had no choice but to accept and realize it. His extraordinary bad luck in this matter was that he chose a 10th level character, even though he had 7 other stronger ones. However, luck was still on his side in financial matters as he had more than enough funds. However, he was disappointed that he couldn't consider this luck, because he was simply locked in the game, which was extremely bad for him and serious. The commander approached Dio and asked him what he was doing on the training ground, moving closer to him. Dio turned around and replied that he was just looking around. Then he suggested that Dio train with them, but Dio said he thought it was a terrible idea because his character wasn't made for that. Then Dio paused for a second, wondering why group training was taking place there, and asked a question about it. He paused for a moment as if he hadn't expected such a question before answering. But then he explained that it was because of the waves of monsters attacking the settlement of Avera, where the non-player characters who are part of the game live. Fighting in this place makes it much easier to level up, and this is part of the training created by the developers. But for Kim Jun, being in this place with a level 10 character is nothing short of a disaster. It was a huge problem, but he understood that now was not the time to get upset about the circumstances. Considering all the circumstances, he also understood that he couldn't die here because if he did, he wouldn't be able to return. And then he realized that he had to try to survive at any cost. Then he began to act and decided not to think too much about what he needed to do next. First, he decided to see what he had in his warehouse and what might be useful. He realized that he needed to change classes in order to win, but with his current skills, this was not yet possible. Then he saw something that surprised him, but he had definitely seen it before and knew what it was. He realized that he had found instructions on how to change classes, which he had never seen before, and he wondered if he could use them now. He noticed that the skill panel here was more realistic than in other games because this game was extremely well designed and had no bugs. The amount of information presented to users is significantly less than in other virtual reality games, and that is why in order to enjoy the game, you have to find hidden content yourself. Many users dislike this game for this very reason, but Kim Jun liked it more than other games. He realized that hidden content had just been unlocked, as he had never heard of such instructions before. He thought that survival was his priority now, but he also understood that there were secrets in this game that he had not yet uncovered. But just the thought of it stirred him up inside. He thanked Grandpa Tony for standing aside all this time and ran in the other direction, as if he knew what he had to do next. Meanwhile, we found ourselves in the mercenary guild of the settlement of Avera. Our hero had already arrived there and stood right at the entrance to the room where there were many people. The people there were surprised to see Dio in this place. They immediately told him with a very unfriendly look that there was definitely a line here, and that Dio had no idea what it was for. When the man looked at Dio's appearance, he realized that Dio did not look like someone who would be allowed to enter such a place. Dio did not respond to the man's remarks, but simply asked to meet with the master, remaining calm and confident. He then threw them an ancient mercenary symbol, which proved that the person who owned it was a mercenary who had achieved the rank of veteran and master. Everyone around understood perfectly well the significance of a person in this world who possessed such an item. Those who had previously said that the air smelled of a youngster now said that they had mistaken this man for a professional. Kim Jun, however, knew that this was an A-rank badge, which was held by less than 1% of mercenaries. It was no surprise that such a badge was found in Dio's inventory among thousands of other useful items. Kim Jun's plan was to first disguise himself as an A-rank mercenary using this badge. He also used a cloak with camouflage abilities so that his identity could not be revealed, and this was also part of the plan. Then he decided to show the people around him another interesting item. This item was an Imperial medal, which is considered a universal pass. But it is also important to note that displaying this item in public can put you in great danger. After showing them all these items, he asked them again about the possibility of meeting the master. All these actions were a bluff, and there was a possibility that Dio would be forced to confirm his identity by attacking him. Suddenly, a man appeared behind him and remarked that a very distinguished person had visited this place. He then introduced himself as Cotton and said he was the captain of the mercenary guild in the settlement of Avera. He took on an extremely serious expression and suggested that Dio come upstairs to discuss an important matter. Kim Jun was scared because one wrong move could mean his death, as this was not just a game but a game in his real life. He then replied to the captain that he had asked to meet with the master, not him. Cotton was polite and kindly informed Dio that the guildmaster was currently absent. He then continued that for this very reason, he was willing to listen to Dio so as not to waste any time. Thus, they decided to proceed, and Kim Jun, in Dio's body, followed Cotton to carry out the last part of his plan, which was to negotiate. Starting the negotiations, Dio stated his request, which was that the mercenary guild accompany him to the Forgotten Temple. Captain Cotton thought about this request because they had already been asked to do this before, but definitely not by an A-rank mercenary, and this was extremely strange. After thinking about it for a moment, Cotton said that they had received a request to escort a priest and that all the mercenaries had been assigned to their tasks. Dio was fine with this option and said he could go with them without any problem. He told Cotton that he didn't need anything else except to get to the temple safely. Then Cotton realized that Dio planned to go with them as the person they were escorting. Dio replied that this was only partly true because if danger arose, he would not sit idly by and would definitely help. After Dio's words, the captain had no choice but to accept his request, as it was beneficial to them to take on another fighter who had no other demands. Dio was happy that everything had worked out, and the guild only had to notify the client that another fighter would be joining them. Dio received a notification from the game system that he had signed a request for mercenary escort and that a new quest would appear soon. Once all the details had been discussed, they agreed to meet in the morning at the northern gate. Dio had to hurry back to prepare because if his identity was revealed, he would be in big trouble. Later, the guild fighters discussed the news that a man with an A rank would be joining them, and they couldn't understand why such a man would be here. But when they saw the man they were talking about walking behind them, they tensed up slightly and began to watch his every word. Dio approached them, and one of the guys introduced himself as Raymond. Dio decided to use a pseudonym and introduced himself as Monty. When he saw the 4 escorts, he was extremely surprised as the number of fighters had probably been reduced because of the quest. And then Dio, under the name Monty, realized that Captain Cotton had deceived him without batting an eye. One of the fighters noted that it was time for them to leave, but for some reason, the priest was still not there. Then they saw a girl who approached them and asked if they would take her to the temple. She apologized to everyone for being late and tried to catch her breath after the forced run. A notification came from the system that Clara, who was a priestess of the Temple of the Moon, had joined the quest. Everyone in the group expressed their respect to Miss Clara as a sign of acquaintance. But Kim June, noticing her clothes, remarked that the journey must have been very difficult for her. She glanced at Monte for a split second and he noticed. Monte thought that with that glance she wanted to show him that she found him very suspicious. He began to think and realized that it was probably just a look of curiosity, since A-rank mercenaries were quite rare. When they set off, the system alerted them that they had entered a new area where the difficulty level clearly exceeded Dio's abilities. Night fell and they stopped to rest, discussing which direction to go next and deciding to take a detour because it was safer. But Monte joined the conversation and said that it would be better to take the route that would take the least amount of time. He meant that they would reach the temple faster if they went in the direction of Camp Number 3 and found a secret cave along the way. A dispute arose between them because the other mercenaries did not know the area around Camp Number 3, but they were very familiar with the area around the detour. Monte said that he could plan their route even with his eyes closed, and that it would be much faster to go through the cave and then through the Downville Forest. Hearing this, the mercenaries became indignant, because they knew what monsters lurked in the Downville Forest. Dio understood that this road was indeed very dangerous, but if they went slowly, they would probably reveal his identity, which could not be allowed to happen. And if they took the long way, they would realize that they were not traveling with a mercenary of rank A, but with an ordinary 10th level character who had no class. Then he realized that he must not be afraid, but rather continue to defend his opinion and point of view, sticking to his guns. Without wasting any time, he told them that he would go to Camp Number 3 anyway because Clara's endurance was extremely low and they needed to get there faster. He began to get angry and tried to explain to the others that he had not come here for fun and that they were trying to waste his time. The funniest thing for Dio was his arrogance because he had asked to join their team himself, and now he was standing there and setting conditions. Then he turned to Miss Clara, trying to find out what she thought about it. She told everyone that she liked Mr. Monty's plan better because she really wanted to get there faster. She then suggested going back the way they came, using the option suggested by Mr. Raymond. Everyone agreed with Monte's decision, hoping that in case of danger, Monte, who was an A-rank mercenary, would be able to save them. Monte told them not to worry about it and realized that the fact that he had been able to win the priestess over to his side was very advantageous for him. When all the details had been discussed, they went to bed as they had a difficult journey ahead of them in the morning and an equally challenging day. Morning came and Kim June felt pain throughout his entire body. He remembered that he used to be able to sleep all day while playing games and still feel alert and rested. But for some reason, now everything was exactly the opposite. Not only had he not rested, but he seemed even more tired. Monte told his entire company that the cave would definitely be on their way and ordered them not to deviate from the set route, as it could be dangerous. Monte saw that one of the mercenaries had strayed off to the side, and this angered him because just a minute ago he had told them not to deviate from the route. But the man who had strayed was just as angry that he had to ask Monte for permission for every step he took. Monte realized that Raymond was probably upset about what had happened the night before. When he realized that he had to give in to the mercenaries, he suggested that the priestess stop and take a break. This only served to heat up the atmosphere in the group and make the other mercenaries angry. At some point, the game system notified Monty that Raymond, a member of his squad, had started bleeding. Monty grinned at this because he had warned them to be extremely careful in this area. But then the A-rank mercenary was told to stop gawking and finally help defeat the werewolf. In response, he showed his principled stance, as he had warned each of them about the possible dangers. Then they told him to stand still and keep quiet, thereby doubting his abilities as a mercenary. But Monty apparently had a different plan and told the priestess Clara to stay close to him. Now he realized that this situation was an excellent opportunity to test the combat abilities of the other mercenary. Looking at them, he realized that even though they were all D-rank mercenaries, they were all at the 100th level. And for them, defeating a werewolf with such a crowd was no problem at all. Then Monty noticed that 2 werewolves had attacked Raymond. Monty then decided to show the others how cool an A-rank mercenary could be by fighting a werewolf that was on the verge of death. He told Clara that he had to help them, as without him, they would definitely not be able to handle it. Monty understood that these mercenaries had enough skills to catch 1 or 2 werewolves like that. However, he also knew that without knowing about one particular ability, it would be difficult to do so without getting injured. Approaching the other mercenaries, he ordered them to step back, shocking everyone. They found it funny that he had come to their aid only when they had practically defeated everyone and decided that there was nothing special about an A-rank. But in response to this remark, Monty said that, on the contrary, there was nothing special about them. Suddenly, the werewolf, whom Raymond believed to be defeated, stood over him, and he couldn't understand how this was even possible. He began to attack again, and they decided to retreat immediately because they realized they couldn't handle it. At that moment, after Raymond and his team's protective shields were broken, Monty entered the battle. Monty, remaining completely unperturbed, looked the werewolf straight in the eyes and ordered them to leave. The werewolf immediately collapsed, completely drained of strength, right in front of the entire mercenary squad. In this way, Monty managed to convince the mercenaries that he had defeated the werewolf with a single blow. Everyone was extremely surprised, but as it turned out, it was just a trick that took advantage of a special feature of these demonic beasts. This feature is that such monsters fall into a state of rage only before death, and in this state, their damage is reduced to 0. In this battle, Monty used a purifying plant against the beast. If this plant is applied to a weapon, it can counteract the berserk effect. Monty was a man who could remember all the characteristics and behavior patterns of monsters. And so, even a difference of 100 levels seemed to make no difference, and he set out to deal with the second werewolf. He knew that this monster attacked from right to left first, and now it was important not to get hit when it came back. He understood that he would need to start his attack after the distance between them had increased significantly. Then his plan was to make the werewolf back into an obstacle. When the werewolf hit his head hard, he would lose his balance for about 5 seconds. At that moment, Monty began to attack the werewolf, and in the end, his tactic obviously worked perfectly. By the time the berserk state was activated, the werewolf monster would already be defeated, and Monty put on quite a show for everyone. An important fact is that even in his normal state, the werewolf would not have been able to defeat him, and it would have been a great stroke of luck to dodge him. After what happened, Clara helped the injured Raymond heal his wounds, saying that it was her job. Later, Monty asked Raymond about his health after the battle. Monty apologized to Raymond, saying that it was all his fault because he had chosen an extremely dangerous path. But Raymond replied that everything was fine because he was also to blame. The others said that despite Monty's rudeness and bad temper, they noted his abilities. Everything was going as well as it could, and the game system was busy reporting on the increase in each mercenary's level of respect and gratitude towards Monty. After some time, they finally managed to reach the cave Monty had mentioned. Intentionally showing his modesty, he told his companions that anyone could have found the way to this place. All the mercenaries looked at Monty with admiration and dreamed of drinking with him and listening to his adventures after they completed their journey together. Monty, however, considered their boundless trust a bad idea, as it was still too early to think about returning. The cave was protected from monsters, so they decided to spend the night there and draw lots to determine the night watch schedule. Monty lost the draw and was left on duty, realizing that everything was going as it should, since he had managed to win the trust of the mercenaries. He was only concerned about one extremely important thing, and that was the major update to the game where he was stuck. He had managed to level up 7 characters to the maximum level and learn the game inside out. But this knowledge could prove useless. And that's why he realized that he needed to act based on the worst possible outcome. Thinking about this, he tried to stay positive and promised himself that he would definitely be able to handle everything. The next morning, they set off on their journey and encountered a huge giant plant. When Monty managed to defeat it, the other mercenaries looked at him with admiration, as if he were a true hero. Monty was able to defeat it with the help of an elixir he had created. While playing as an alchemist character, he had leveled up to the maximum level. However, Monty was extremely disappointed about the experience points he had lost due to changing classes. Seeing how a mercenary named Rika was fighting, Monty said that it was much more effective in battles with plants not to attack, but to separate its parts. He taught Raymond that such enemies should be attacked a little more aggressively. Everyone thanked the A-rank mercenary Monty for his advice, which was really helpful. Then the whole group approached the next destination of their journey, which was a place that looked like a hole. Monty was determined to crawl through the hole as it was the shortest way to the temple. The other mercenaries began to worry that if anyone was overweight, they simply wouldn't be able to squeeze through. Monty reached out his hand to the priestess Clara to accompany her and asked her to be careful. The priestess was probably frightened, but she trusted Monty's words and reached out her hand to him in response. Monty explained to her that when they approached the opening, they would fall through and warned her so that she would not be too frightened. They jumped and began to fall as if into an endless abyss, straight down into the unknown. When Clara landed on the ground, she held her head and did not understand where she was. They found themselves in a huge building, and Clara couldn't stop admiring the beauty around her. The other mercenaries landed behind her and were just as surprised to see such a place, while Clara looked at the wall paintings. But Monty knew that these frescoes depicted key moments in the plot and clues to completing the game. One of the frescoes in Kim Jun's memory depicted a battle between the god of evil and the goddess of the moon. This symbolized the confrontation between devilish chaos and divine order. Raymond noticed one of the frescoes where he thought he saw someone being killed, and he asked his partner about it. But his opinion turned out to be wrong because it depicted a knight's initiation, where the knight was a hero in golden armor. When Monte noticed the fresco, he immediately ran closer, pushing Raymond aside. Looking at the image more closely, he thought that it was very different from what had been there before. For a second, he thought about it, going over the information he had in his head. Then he remembered that this was the knight he had seen in the trailer for the game. Priestess Clara had said that it was a kind of prophecy because she had seen many things in temples, but this was the first time she had seen something like this in such a place. Then Monty realized that she was probably a priestess of the Temple of the Moon, but he didn't understand the meaning of the inscription on the image. It was an ancient language that was no longer used, and Clara translated the inscription as someone announcing that they had arrived at the end of the world. Hearing these words, Monty realized that they were from the first verse of the trailer for the game's update, and then he understood another important thing. He realized that most likely in the temple where they were all heading, a new mission awaited him, one he had not yet participated in. He was extremely frightened, but he couldn't stop because moving forward was the only way to survive in this game. Gathering his thoughts, he called on all his companions to continue their journey to the temple. As he passed by, he saw the same golden statue of a knight in armor that was depicted in the fresco in the trailer. Clara couldn't pass by without noticing it either, remarking that the statue was simply beautiful. Monty was sure that the statue would start moving at any moment. Clara explained to Monty that the church had already confirmed that this place was safe, so he had nothing to worry or fret about. Then Monty thought that there was a huge difference between when a resident of the game, who was not involved in it, came to the location, and when a player came there. He then thought that if this statue was the guardian of the temple, their entire group would hardly be able to defeat it, and would perish in an instant. Then one of our heroes saw the altar and the system announced that they had entered the area of lost ancient heritage. When they reached the location, the system also reported that the mission to escort the priestess had been successfully completed. Kim Jun understood that by completing the first mission, he would be able to achieve his original mission of changing his class. Suddenly, a new scroll appeared in front of him, stating that he had fulfilled the first hidden condition of the quest. Suddenly, something completely abnormal and terrifying began to happen. Stones seemed to be flying everywhere, and the priestess, who had not yet managed to leave their company, was screaming because she did not understand what was happening and was terrified. The thing was that the statue had started to move, just as Monty had said. Not only did the statue continue to move, but it also began to rise and emit a magical purple light. Kim Jun realized that this was not a temple guardian or any other creature like that. It was a Death Knight, which is not easy to fight even with a skill level of 300 in this game. Then our player realized that such an opponent could not possibly appear in a battle at the 100th level, and things took an interesting turn. His instincts as an experienced gamer told him that such an opponent was not here by accident. He realized that defeating this knight was probably not the ultimate goal of this mission. He began to reason that in ZGF games, the ultimate goals are never revealed, which means that this mission could be bypassed somehow. At that moment, the system again displayed a message stating that Monte had instructions to change classes and that the quest had been activated. The task of this quest was to obtain the Sword of the Death Knight, who was currently their enemy. Recalling all his past moments when he played this game, there were days when Monty searched for answers and ways to pass the game on the internet. On the World Wide Web, on various forums, he found information that such a knight cannot pierce the holy shield of the priest. In other words, the best option in such a fight would be to use the shield as a trap and skip the first phase. And so this knight was ready to attack, but first he asked how they dared to come to this sanctuary. Seeing all this, Clara shouted to Mr. Monty that this was an extremely dangerous situation. But Monty, without wasting any time, turned to the priestess with a request. He asked the priestess Clara to activate the holy shield. He understood that the trigger for this quest was an instruction, which meant that the event could be activated at level 10 or lower. When the priestess realized that Monty intended to fight, she shouted that it was completely pointless because they simply had no chance. He, in turn, tried to explain to her that they had no chance of escaping and therefore asked her to activate the Holy Shield as soon as possible. He asked her to do it as quickly as possible before the knight caught up with them. Without hesitation, she began to fulfill Monty's request and activated the Holy Shield. As she created the shield, she said that the power of the moonlight would surely protect them. Monty stood behind her, waiting for the right moment to attack, while Clara watched and listened carefully to his every word. And when the time was right, Monty told Clara to attack, and she immediately obeyed. In just 1 second, they managed to defeat the ill-fated knight. Clara, realizing what had happened, did not understand how Monty could have known this information and considered him an amazing person. Monty turned around and told everyone that it was not yet time to celebrate victory, for he knew that the battle was not over yet. The battle was not over, for there was still a knight with a sword that they needed to get their hands on. At that moment, he thought that he had done everything as instructed on the internet forum, and that they had missed the first phase. The first phase was immediately followed by the second, which also required action. Lady Clara seemed worried and asked Monty to be extremely careful. He decided to shout that his opponent probably wouldn't recognize him. At that moment, the system indicated that the quest condition had been fulfilled. In any game like this, the Death Knight is a special enemy, and this game is no exception. And if you start talking about yourself during the battle, a dialogue window automatically opens and the second phase stops. He remembers that all the hints for completing the quest were in the ZGF trailer, which showed Lady Dark as a knight in golden armor. It was shown that she was waiting for a messenger who had run away for reinforcements, but the messenger did not return, and she became a Death Knight. The messenger who never returned became a wandering ghost, and Monty's Imperial Medal is an item given for capturing this ghost. He shouted at the knight standing right in front of him, addressing him as Lady Dark. He showed her the Imperial Medal and said that he had come with his mission successfully completed. The knight leaned closer to Monty and said that he had completed the task. The system revealed that Monty had discovered that Adelia Dark was the first holy knight of the ancient sacred kingdom. The knight continued saying that an extremely long time had passed since they had been defeated and lost their god. The knight said that the wait had lasted forever, and that many of her comrades had died, such as Renbolt Fonte Chris and another name that Monte did not hear. He had a terrible feeling that the last name mentioned had been hidden on purpose, as if someone had deliberately added noise there. Looking at the Imperial Medal, he wondered if all the conditions for successfully completing the quest had been met. He was angry with himself because he couldn't remember which moment he might have missed. The knight turned to Monty and addressed him as a recruit, awakening long-forgotten hope in him. And after these words, Lady Dark in the knight's body thrust her sword straight at Monty. Monty thought that this moment was very similar to what he had seen in the frescoes. He remembered the words from the song in the trailer that spoke of a magnificent flower blooming during battle, and then it dawned on Monty that he had not noticed all the clues in the trailer. He thought that Lady Adelia Dark was waiting not only for the messenger, but also for the promised reinforcements, and perhaps she was simply longing for the one she loved. Monty realized that if the event had started right now, he probably had a clue to complete this quest, and this event was probably connected to the person Dark had been waiting for all this time. For a second, he thought about the A-rank mercenary badge he had and how he got it in the Temple of Tart, which was connected to an ancient kingdom. Then he realized that the items that existed before were not just a coincidence, but definitely a new use for old things. Monty decided to approach the knight and tell him that he was still waiting for someone while in the body of a Death Knight. He showed the knight the A-rank mercenaries badge, which he believed definitely belonged to the one he was waiting for. After that, the knight began to transform back, and the system said that Monty had helped end Dark's wait and that she deserved to walk the path of truth. Lady Dark realized that the man still loved her even if she wanted revenge, and she worried that her appearance would never be the same. She moved closer to Monty and thanked him for saving her when she was on the brink between light and darkness. And when she said that Monty had made her heart flutter, he replied that he was not the one she had been waiting for all this time. He went on to explain that he was only a messenger who had brought her something that belonged to that person. But in response, she only repeated that she already knew that. With her own hands, she reached for the sign of the A rank that Monty was holding out to her. Taking the sign in her hands, she asked him to send her beloved soul to heaven, for he was her son and the flower of her soul, as she said aloud. And when she finally returned to her former self, the system announced that the story of the fallen knight had been successfully completed. This could only mean one thing. Monty had received the ghostly sword of the ancient dead and gained the attribute of life energy. The system then announced that Monty's status would change as new attributes were added, but Monty did not yet understand what this meant. Kim Jun opened his eyes and did not understand what had just happened, as if he had lost consciousness for a moment. Looking around, he saw the walls of his room but still couldn't come to his senses. He thought that everything he had seen was just a dream, because in his opinion the game could not possibly become reality. He began to think that it was all unreal and even felt upset by this thought. Then he faintly heard the name of his character, Monte, in his subconscious. And then he jumped up, realizing that life in the real world was just a dream, but he was scared. In front of him, he saw the priestess Clara, who was happy to see Monty come to his senses. Then the rest of the mercenary army appeared in Monty's field of vision, and they were also overjoyed to see him. They were amazed at how Monty had managed to defeat that creature alone and remain unharmed. But Monty understood that all these enthusiastic guys had simply fled as soon as the knight came into view. Monty asked them to leave him alone so he could rest and collect his thoughts. The ghostly sword Monty had obtained had a level restriction of 350 and special limitations. Monty had never encountered such items before and therefore did not yet understand what these special restrictions meant. As Monty expected, the changes in the game were global, and the only thing he knew was that this update was related to the ancient Holy Kingdom. Then he was struck by an extremely important thought. He would not be able to revive. For this reason, he decided that he must be extremely cautious and careful in his future actions. When Monty went outside, he was met by the priestess Clara, who asked how he was feeling. Monty replied that Clara should take the mercenaries and continue on her way, but that he needed to finish his business at the temple. He decided to stop all hesitation and opened the scroll with the instructions. Immediately after that, the system displayed a message that all the conditions in the instructions had been fulfilled, and a class change was beginning. He realized that the knight had transferred all her energy to him along with her sword. The game system displayed a message stating that Monty's new class was called the Forgotten Swordsman, and that he had been assigned a normal rank. Along with the class change and level increase, experience points from the monsters Monty had caught also began to accumulate. As it turned out, Monty had never heard of such a class in all the time he had been in the ZGF. After that, he began to think that his expectations had been too high in this matter. At that moment, the priestess Clara and the mercenaries returned from their successful mission and asked Monty to return to the settlement. Monty looked at them all and realized that everything had gone as well as it could have, so he decided to return. They continued their journey, and the system announced that they had entered the settlement of Avera. Raymond said that the training was intense and that he felt stronger, but Monty understood that he had only used them for his own purposes. Raymond also said that now they needed to go to the guild to report, but Monty had no plans to go there because he had nothing to report. The priestess Clara joined the conversation, saying that her church would reward him because they had encountered difficulties and circumstances on their journey. Raymond was persistent in persuading Monty to drink, confidently calling him by the name Hyun. Monty noted that he had grown attached to these guys, but he had other important business to attend to first. And because Monty had concealed his true identity, he decided to keep his distance and left, postponing their meeting for later. His companions were completely taken aback by this turn of events and were clearly upset by it. Monty was finally able to remove his cloak, transforming back into his former character, Dio. He understood that he needed to start preparing because the reason he took such a risk to change classes was to battle a wave of monsters. In the game system, he opened his character's status window to familiarize himself with what he was about to face. Looking at the new values he didn't recognize, he wondered if they could be related to Adelia Dark, who was a Death Knight. He realized that it was the red energy he had obtained from her that was the key to gaining the ability to change classes. At one point, he became very scared at the thought of having to develop a character from scratch to the highest levels and skills. But he immediately told himself to calm down because he had already gone through this with every character he had managed to develop to the maximum level. The only difference from previous games was that this was now his real reality. Now he needed to raise his skill level so that he could resist the monsters, and he decided to focus on that. Initially, he decided to test all the skills he had acquired after changing his character's class. He had the ability of liberation, which consisted of signing a contract with a person who would become dependent on the spellcaster. When the contract is signed, 10% of the person's stats are lost, so the person must be significantly stronger than the caster. Otherwise, it is useless. The next ability he acquired was Dissection, which Dio considered a very ordinary attack. When Dio tried to use this ability, the system notified him that skills could change depending on the player's status and condition. He then realized that the change in skills was the red energy he had received from the Night Dark. Then the game system said that the power of the Forgotten Sword had detected the seal of fire, and therefore the slash skill was now modified. Dio looked at the instructions for the skill he had received, which said that it was a technique in which the power absorbed the energy of fire. Dio, looking at this, noted that this skill had become quite impressive, and now he understood why his class had a development type. All this was because all his skills were developing and changing under the influence of the power of the Night Adelia Dark. He realized that the fiery substance that is a prerequisite for developing skills is stored in the inventory in another large city. Alternatively, this item could drop when a high-level monster was defeated, but first he needed to increase his level. At that point, he realized that he needed to develop his character to at least level 50 in order to fight monsters. Dio's character development began with defeating an armored turtle of level 83, which was considered a common monster. The armored turtle is huge but very slow, so it was easy to defeat by using dodging and speed. And that is why it was possible to defeat the armored turtle, even with a huge difference in levels. When Dio defeated the armored turtle, he was able to raise his level to 36, gaining 3,015 experience points. Dio understood that he could have done much better if he had a weapon, but what he had in his inventory did not match his level. However, Dio was diligent and began to develop his forgotten weapon skills, reaching the second level out of a possible 100. He trained diligently and was able to reach the 16th level out of 100 possible levels of forgotten sword techniques. Time after time, blow after blow, he rapidly developed his technique and has now reached level 38 out of 100. Dio trained hard to reach the level he wanted faster, and then the system announced that he was at level 50. His next task was to collect all the items he needed from the warehouse. Immediately, a new quest appeared where he had to stop a wave of approaching monsters within a certain time limit. He was ordered to fortify all structures and prepare for battle as the monsters would soon begin their attack. And when the monsters appeared in sight, the archers were ordered to take up their positions and begin aiming. When everything was ready, the order was given to begin the attack with arrows. The next order from the platoon commander was given to the shield bearers that the 3rd platoon's defenses had been breached and to hold them back. They tried with all their might to hold back the monsters so that they could not enter the settlement. At one point, Dio joined the battle and immediately began attacking. The commander was shocked to see the fighter who had joined them. They were delighted to see Mr. Monty, whom they believed to be an A-rank fighter. He thanked Monty for his help, saying that he had heard many good things about his name and reputation. Looking closer at Monty, he noticed that his face seemed strangely familiar. And that was indeed the case, for it was precisely him they had encountered earlier when Dio first realized he was stuck in the game. Monty replied that it was just a coincidence, as they couldn't have met anywhere else before. In any case, the commander thanked Monty for his help, saying that the assistance of an A-rank fighter gave them hope. Then the commander said he would send his best fighters to help Monty in this battle. Monty said he would try his best, even though he knew that the monster's level was far higher than his own. Monty used magic lenses to recognize the strength of monsters below the beginner level. These abilities were available to him because of the items in his inventory. This allowed him to identify the targets that needed to be dealt with first. He chose monsters that he could defeat with a single blow. The other fighters could only watch in awe as Monty bravely dealt with the monsters, sending them to their deaths one after another. But in reality, Monty's goal at that moment was to develop his skills and abilities. However, due to the nature of the quest, he couldn't form a group with the game's inhabitants, so he had to defeat enemies to gain experience. The other fighters were surprised that Monty was using such a huge sword to attack, but they understood that a rank A mercenary didn't know any other way. The next monsters they had to defeat were the werewolves, whom Monty hated. Without hesitation, Monty swiftly began attacking them as well. Monty gained 3,218 experience points, and then another 2,084 points. Monty said that the constant notifications from the system were annoying him, but one of the fighters thought he was talking about him. The fighters kept asking Monty for help and shouted that the monsters were pushing them back. Monty noticed that the remaining monsters were running out of strength. Realizing that this was the prey he had been looking for, he shouted for everyone to step back and quickly began to attack. He launched his first attack against the insect enemies. When Monty launched his second attack, the fighters did not understand why he was attacking so weakly, since the monsters were counterattacking. Monty's third attack was also quick to follow. The commander continued to watch, but he sincerely did not understand why Monty was attacking in this way, and found it all extremely strange. When he launched his fourth and fifth attacks, there was a huge explosion that sent all the enemies to the afterlife. Everyone realized that Monty had used magic and understood that Monty was a magical swordsman. They looked at Monty and discussed how he probably didn't receive the Imperial Medal for nothing. Finally, Monty's skill level reached the 100th mark, and the condition for developing the explosion skill was met, but Monty did not yet know what it was. It turned out that he was now able to mark enemies he attacked and combine slashes with additional skills. This was equivalent to being able to create an explosion by touching up to 5 enemies with his sword. However, this skill had one drawback. Not only enemies could take damage, but also the caster himself. Realizing this, he came up with a solution, and to do so, he needed to dig through his inventory. After doing so, he was able to obtain salamander armor, which increased his armor rating and improved several related stats. This allowed him to create absolute immunity to future explosions. The fact that the insect monsters were not resistant to fire was only to Monty's advantage. The commander informed everyone that a huge monster was invading their battle territory and had already reached the central square. It was Guillotine Bear, a well-known monster of level 150. Monty knew that its level was several times higher than his own, and higher than the average level of the inhabitants of Avera. This meant that the best option for Monty was to avoid it, and leave the battle to the garrison. But the commander had a different opinion as he ordered everyone to retreat and leave the battle with the bear to Mr. Monty. Monty, in turn, could think of nothing better than to tell him that he did not need any special treatment. He said that even without his orders, he planned to deal with the bear guillotine. At first glance, it might seem that the bear is attacking completely recklessly, but in fact, this monster had its own well-established tactics. Monty understood that his explosion techniques would be ineffective against the bear's thick skin, so he needed another plan. And that is why he decided to run into the crowd of other monsters. And the bear, setting off in pursuit of the bear, didn't even realize that he was hurting himself. Monty had a brilliant plan in mind, which he was about to put into action. He threw the bottle of liquid right in the bear's face. The bear didn't seem to understand what had just happened and froze for a second, stopping his attack. Without thinking twice, Monty shouted for the explosion to begin, and it immediately happened to the enemy bear. Less than a minute later, Guillotine's opponent was defeated and fell lifeless to the ground. The other opponents watched silently as everything unfolded around them. Now Monty began to attack the rest, realizing that explosions were definitely a kind of art. Later, Monty continued his journey through the forest in a wagon, but suddenly their wagon was stopped, with the argument that a small inspection was necessary. Looking inside the wagon, they saw Monty, whom they believed to be a monster hunter. The man said he had heard about Monty's successes in the settlement of Avera, and asked about his further destination in River North. Saying that it would be an honor to travel with him, he said he would wait for them there. When Monty thought about how he had become more famous than he had planned, the system announced that they had entered the Paramount Plains. Monty is now heading to a warehouse in River North for a fiery substance, thinking that he needs to take it from that warehouse. An idea popped into his head and he decided to ask the coachman, who kindly agreed to answer any questions he had. Monty asked the driver about any news he had heard about the Empire. He said that he knew that about 10 days ago, a group of bandits had started a rebellion in the west. Many people were saying that the Third Prince was gathering troops to suppress the uprising. Monty had already completed this quest earlier when he was a different character, and now it would help him establish a relationship with Prion, who was the Third Prince. The coachman also told Monty that the number of missing persons in River North had increased, which was causing the Lord many problems. Monty already knows several important details about this plot arc, and graciously thanked the coachman for the useful information. Although the city was still very far away, Monty asked the coachman to drop him off right there in the middle of the plains. Monty took off his hood and thought about how tired he was of hiding his identity from everyone. It turned out that the reason for stopping in the plains was not simply Monty's desire to reach his destination on foot. The reason was that Monty remembered that there was a hidden quest to complete in this place. He thought about the slave traders' cave in the Tyr Mountains bordering the plains, where the most inhumane groups of bandits lived. He understood that they were responsible for the disappearance of people in the vicinity of River North, kidnapping and trading people, among other criminal activities. Monty had no intention of punishing those people for their criminal activities, as his goal was to obtain the elixir of agility by capturing the leader. As he approached the cave, he overheard two bandits talking about how their recent deal had gone very well. They planned to take a break once they had dealt with one important matter. They dreamed aloud that once their business was done, they would be able to drink to their heart's content. Monty listened humbly to their every word, waiting for the right moment to attack, and prepared a rope for this purpose. One of the bandits, who suspected nothing, began to tell his partner that they should definitely have some fun today. Before he could finish his sentence, the rope thrown by Monty began to wrap around the enemy. The second bandit from the group looked up and saw Monty, completely unaware of his intention to attack them. Without thinking twice, one of them shouted to the rest of his group that they were under attack and that someone had invaded their territory. Monty understood that their average level was 50 and that there was no need to use his skills against them. Then he saw a cage with a small singing bird chirping sweetly inside. He let it out of the cage and told the bird not to let those scoundrels catch it again, and then he received a warning that he was in the slave trader's hideout. He also overheard a conversation about how they had been offered such a large sum for their work, but their leader replied that it didn't matter, which was not true about the money they would receive. They began discussing how no one in River North would be able to find them, but the leader of this group was sure that greedy aristocrats would not spend their own money searching this vast plain. Then, to their surprise, a barrel of liquor rolled up, and at first they didn't understand what was going on. One of the bandits began to talk about the audacity of the man who dared to bring alcohol to their leader in such a manner. At that moment, Monty appeared in their field of vision and pointed out that their leader had already drunk too much. They couldn't utter a sound for a short time simply because they were shocked by what they saw. They began to attack Monty, saying that he would definitely not make it out of there alive. But in a matter of seconds, Monty dealt with all of them, telling one of them that he would take care of the rest on his way to their lair. Monty looked confidently at the last remaining bandit, telling him that he was the only one left to die. Then Monty, saying that this was getting boring, suggested ending it all as quickly as possible. After fighting with Monty, the bandit begged for mercy and asked why he had attacked, as he still did not understand the reason. Monty, looking at them, understood that they did not deserve to continue living on this earth and in this world. Anger appeared in Monty's eyes because he doubted that this group had spared the lives of those who had begged them to do so. But in reality, Monty needed the key he had received from this criminal. He opened the chest and obtained the desired elixir of agility, which gave him 5 levels of agility to his skills for an indefinite period. He immediately opened the elixir and began to drink it, feeling his strength returning. When he completed this quest, Monty set out to continue his journey. Suddenly, he heard a voice that definitely came from behind a wall, which he immediately approached. He understood that since the slave sale had been completed, no one should be left here. He was curious, so he didn't ignore it and approached the place where the sound was coming from. Upon entering, he could see prisoners locked in cages. It was quite difficult to look at, even though it was just a game. In the same place, Monty remembered there was a wooden door. Without wasting any time, Monty opened the door and entered the room. When he saw the girl sitting with her head bowed, he knew he was right. The girl looked at Monty and with a desperate look, begged him to just take her life. Monty knew perfectly well when he came to this place that he would find her here. She was a minor character whom these bandits had sold to a black magician to be sacrificed during a ritual. Her younger brother was Sigmund, who was the deputy commander of the River North Knights. And this incident marked the beginning of his story. He then became the strongest sword of the Church of the Moon, known as the Knight of Justice. Monty understood that Sepia's death was a key event directly related to the main plot of the game, and no one was able to save her. She was marked with a seal of death that could not be removed by any elixir or spell, and therefore everyone considered her a character doomed to die. She kept repeating to Monty and begging him to let her die. But given the circumstances, he no longer knew what to do. He remembered his ability to make a contract with a vow of release. Monty carefully read the instructions for the oath of release, but he wasn't sure if it would remove Sepia's mark. However, he felt that it would work. But there was one problem. In order to conclude the contract, he would lose 10% of his strength, and he didn't know if it was worth it. Then he thought about why he was even considering it, because even though he was a character in a game, this was now his reality. He felt ashamed that he was even doubting himself at a time when he could see a person suffering. It seemed he had already made his final decision because he believed he was not like those monsters who sold people. He leaned closer to Sepia and told her he could save her. He told her that there was a way to remove the mark of death from her, and she looked at Monty in surprise. He told her everything and asked if she would agree to make such a decision. Sepia looked at him with tears in her eyes, letting him know that she had made the right decision. They reached out their hands to each other, and the system announced that the vow of liberation had been used, and that the subject had entered into a contract with Monty. The condition of the contract was that the amount of endurance taken depended on the condition of the subject, and if it was insufficient, the contract would be terminated. After the contract was signed, everything lit up with a bright light, and the system announced that a hidden quest had been discovered called Sepia's Rescue. In an instant, he was transported to a completely terrifying place, but he didn't yet understand where he was, as this was his first time completing this quest. In front of him, he saw an endless number of monsters attacking him, and just as many warriors in golden armor were flying toward him at breakneck speed. Monty thought that he had never seen such patterns on the armor of those fighters before, and did not yet understand what to do. At the same time, various three-headed monsters began to appear in Monty's field of vision, looking extremely frightening and powerful. They had the ability to shoot fire from their mouths, and Monty realized that if things continued in this vein, the people were doomed to lose. At that moment, a girl with golden hair appeared as if from heaven. She stared intently at Monty, but he still did not understand. She closed her eyes and, turning to Monty, blessed him with the words, "May the light be with you." Then he suddenly woke up again next to Sepia, thinking that what he had seen was just a kind of vision connected with her. Monty felt that all these events were not accidental, and allowed himself to think that Sepia was not a minor character. Immediately, a message from the system informed him that he had moved to the second level of the Vow of Liberation, where 90% of his endurance would be lost. He was then asked to continue signing the contract, and he chose to accept. Immediately after that, the neutralization of the weakening curse began. The player's remaining stamina began to drop rapidly, and the percentage of remaining stamina became smaller and smaller. Sepia gradually regained consciousness, and this was noticeable even to the naked eye. The system began to warn that Monty had only 10% stamina left, and he began to feel ill, thinking that he had been too overconfident. The changes in his condition were noticeable not only by the indicators, as the pain spread throughout Monty's body. Sepia, meanwhile, slowly began to open her eyes as she regained consciousness. Sepia began to feel her pain recede and felt the red energy, how warm and soft it was. She did not understand why this man was sacrificing himself for her. Then a notification from the system appeared, stating that the quest to free Sepia had been successfully completed, and the second level of the Vow of Liberation skill had been achieved. Monty didn't want to hear anything about it, as the pain throughout his body gave him no peace. He picked Sepia up and set off in search of a safe place for both of them. Sepia initially thought that her own brother had saved her, but when she looked at Monty, she realized that it wasn't her brother because he didn't have silver hair. Despite the fact that Monty was a complete stranger to her, she was not afraid of him, quite the opposite. When she came to, she was surprised to find that her mind was no longer clouded and the pain had simply disappeared. Looking around, she saw a man she didn't know sleeping next to her. Although she did not know his name, she understood perfectly well that he had sacrificed himself to save her, and thought that her brother had sent him. But she began to doubt this when she saw that he did not look like a knight from River North. She couldn't help but notice the crude weapon, which looked clean and neat, and the absence of any wounds or scars on his body. At that moment, Monty awoke from his sleep and met the gaze of the rescued Sepia with her silver hair. When he got up from the ground, she jumped back in fear. He crouched down again, and finding himself at the same level as Sepia, held out his hand and introduced himself as Dio. She introduced herself in return and thanked him for saving her. She began to inquire about the reasons for his actions, hinting that she suspected her brother's involvement. Dio knew nothing about Sepia except that she was Sigmund's sister and a victim of the wizard, as she disappears early on in the game. He thought that even if he pretended to know her brother, it would only confuse everyone, so he decided to ask her about her brother. Without answering Dio's question, she wanted to understand why he had saved her. Dio replied that he had done it only for her gratitude, as he couldn't think of a more meaningful answer for her. He told her that he had only dreamed of being thanked. She looked at him without commenting on what she had heard, and Dio thought that such a response was extremely strange. They tried not to talk much, but nothing came of it because Sepia probably didn't remember anything. In any case, Sepia, who is 19 years old and has reached level 15, is now under Dio's command. New abilities appeared, such as obedience, which forces her to obey the caster's orders, and a connection that prevents her from going far away, as well as dissolution. Termination means taking the life of the person who broke the vow, and Dio thought these restrictions were stricter than he had imagined. But he also understood that without this harsh skill, Sepia would have faced a painful death. Dio had no choice but to tell Sepia about the necessity of obedience without scaring her, and he tried to establish contact with her through conversation. Since she was the sister of Sigmund, who was the deputy commander at River North, he would suggest that they go there first. But it was clear from Sepia's expression that she was still involuntarily afraid of Dio, whom she hardly knew. Dio understood her feelings perfectly because to her he was no different from those evil slave traders. He addressed her by name and asked her to take his hand. Sepia was very frightened and did not rush to take Dio's hand. But Dio told her that it was an order that must be obeyed, and a magical light shone in his eyes. In that very moment, Dio's order was obeyed without question. Sepia did not understand why she had given Dio her hand, as she did not want to do so at all and did not understand how this had happened. Dio, without wasting any time, told her that from now on they were bound by an oath, and for this reason she was now directly dependent on him. He explained that a subordinate would suffer if they strayed too far from the spellcaster or failed to obey orders, and that these were simply the terms of the contract. He explained that he had to do this to save her, and that from now on she would have to be with him all the time, whether Sepia liked it or not. Sepia was undoubtedly extremely shocked by what she heard and stood there unable to move. Dio understood her feelings perfectly well and knew that she would hardly want to follow a man she hardly knew. Another important point was that if she reunited with her brother, she would still have to leave Dio. Suddenly, the system announced that Sepia's trust level had increased by 3 levels, but Dio did not understand why. Sepia explained that she now owed Dio her life and asked him to take good care of her. Dio was surprised that Sepia had accepted the situation so quickly, and then they decided to go to River North together. Meanwhile, the villains were discussing the disappearance of Sepia's victim. One of the gang members offered an explanation, saying that when he arrived at the scene, none of their group were alive. This victim was very important to the villain, and he punished the gang member for not taking her captivity seriously. The fact was that Sepia had originally been kidnapped in order to deal with her brother, Sigmund. But it turned out that she had the potential of an archmage or even more. And if they sacrificed someone with such potential, they could advance from the 3rd circle to the 7th circle in one go. Another subordinate ran up with a report that they had managed to determine her location, as she had not gotten far from the cave. He ordered everyone to follow her and promised that he would personally deal with the scoundrel who had stolen her. Meanwhile, Dio and Sepia were moving extremely slowly because the girl's strength had not yet fully recovered. Suddenly, he caught himself thinking that something bad was coming and that they needed to leave this place as quickly as possible. Sepia distracted him from his thoughts by asking him a question. Her question was about Dio telling her that he was a wandering mercenary, but she didn't understand where he got his strength from and started bombarding him with questions. Dio understood that she was bombarding him with questions because she had finally come to her senses, and he replied that he had gained this power by accident in one of the temples. But after Dio's answer, a notification from the system appeared, saying that Sepia's trust level had dropped by 1 point. Dio was not at all surprised to hear this, as gaining Sepia's trust was quite difficult. Then he asked her how she had been kidnapped, but Sepia seemed unwilling to answer and asked if it was an order. In order to calm the situation, Dio replied in the negative, saying that she did not have to tell him anything if she did not want to. After Dio's words, Sepia's trust in him increased again, reaching its previous level, and Dio considered her quite nice based on this. She then said that she had nothing to hide from the man who had saved her life. But suddenly, Dio grabbed Sepia by the wrist, squeezing her hand tightly in his palm. Then he pulled her sharply toward him so that she was right behind him. Sepia did not understand what was happening and asked Dio about it. In response, he simply asked her to turn around because he had seen something strange there. Sepia immediately obeyed Dio's order and turned around as he had asked. There she saw a manifestation of sinister energy that she recognized immediately without having time to look closely. Sepia realized that this was probably not just a case of ordinary bandits. When the group approached, Dio immediately recognized Victor and called out his name. It was surprising to his opponent that Dio knew his name and asked about their previous acquaintance, since he did not remember such a moment. But then Victor realized that Dio probably recognized him by a distinctive mark. Victor's complaint was that Dio had dared to steal something that belonged to him, referring to Sepia. But Dio, with a sly smile on his face, sarcastically apologized for his actions. As an apology, he offered Victor to accept his attack. The shells thrown by Dio caused a very frightening explosion. Seeing that everything had gone well, Dio said that at that moment, the score was 1-1. Victor, however, saw this situation as the beginning of fun for him. Dio thought that Victor had not suffered any serious damage from the explosion, as he was a third circle magician. The fact that Victor had not managed to reach the fifth circle by sacrificing Sepia was a great stroke of luck for Dio, as their powers were now roughly equal. When Dio realized that he could defeat him with 100% confidence, a counterattack from the third circle mage Victor immediately flew at him. But Dio had no intention of accepting his attacks and began to dodge them. Victor, looking at Dio, assessed his agility, as he did not know that Dio had such speed. And finally, they came face to face in their serious confrontation. It wasn't long before Dio struck Victor again. And then Victor could think of nothing better than to build a magical shield to protect himself. But as it turned out, this method was not useful for Victor's defense, as Dio easily destroyed it with his blow. The other members of that sinister group realized that things were taking a serious turn and therefore began to defend their master. Dio, however, did not stop attacking with his projectiles, which exploded one after another. While Victor's sinister group tried to build a magic circle to protect him, Dio continued his relentless attack, and after numerous attacks, only one opponent remained. At that moment, Victor cast a curse spell that would follow his opponent no matter how hard he tried to escape. This was Victor's sinister plan to bring about the end of his target. But Dio was much more cunning and took cover behind one of the members of the group, thanking him for his help. He sarcastically remarked to Victor about his amazing aim, calling him Grandpa. Victor was extremely annoyed by the events that had unfolded just minutes earlier. Victor was simply furious and therefore decided to continue attacking Dio. Dio, however, was not afraid and considered the flash to be simply a foolish move by Victor, made out of desperation. Dio also noted that Victor was too slow for a third circle mage. Victor replied that if Sepia were in his hands, he would have been in the 7th magic circle long ago. Dio obviously did not believe Victor's words, as he knew that he could only reach the 5th magic circle. Without listening to Victor's words, Dio began to attack him again. He again used attack techniques that had the ability to explode upon reaching their target. Dio began to confidently move closer and closer to Victor, saying that the game was over and that it was time to finish. As he got closer, Dio felt a very strange sensation, the meaning of which he did not understand right away. He thought of an explosion, which is a fire-type skill, but he knew that it shouldn't move like that. At that moment, tears ran down Sepia's face, accompanied by whimpering. Dio couldn't help but notice this and turned toward her, looking at her with concern. But Sepia clearly had a completely different plan, and now she too entered the fray with the villain. Dio didn't understand what Sepia was trying to do at that moment. Gathering all her energy, she shouted that Victor must also feel this pain, and instantly chains tightly bound the villain Victor's entire body. Sepia's face changed instantly as if she was completely overcome with rage. Dio watched with interest, thinking about the magic Sepia was using. Dio understood that what he was seeing was a manifestation of transcendent magic used by the inhabitants of the game. But Dio also knew that such characters only appeared in later content of the game, and only as high-ranking characters. He began to wonder why she could use this magic. Sepia, seemingly drained of all strength, fell straight into Dio's arms. He hugged her and realized that she probably hadn't learned to control her abilities yet. Meanwhile, a man burst into the deputy commander's office with a report that they had managed to find Sepia's trail. Sepia's brother Sigmund, who was the youngest deputy commander of the River North Knights, couldn't believe his ears. He was told that the trail had been found on the border between the plains and the Tyr Mountains. They also believed that bandits and slave traders were probably involved in the matter. Upon hearing this, Sigmund immediately gave orders to find them and destroy them immediately. Sigmund himself was extremely worried and missed his older sister Sepia. Meanwhile, our heroes continued on their way, and Sepia agreed with Dio that the route he had suggested was indeed the right one. Dio had no doubts about the correctness of their path, for he knew exactly what he was talking about. Dio realized that Sepia still had serious doubts about trusting him, and he understood her perfectly. After all, he would have had doubts in her place, since he was going ahead without a map or a compass. Dio thought about how he didn't want to undermine her trust, and that was why he had to keep his mouth shut and not say anything stupid. Then he thought about how he hadn't suspected that Sepia possessed such power, and how foolish it was of him to think of her as just someone to protect. Immediately after the incident, Dio checked her status window and saw that all her stats were completely normal, but her class was still hidden. And then he thought that she probably had the same potential as her brother Sigmund. When they had walked part of the way, Dio suggested that Sepia look ahead, as they had almost reached River North. Sepia just nodded in response and looked at him very strangely. Dio realized that before he could start learning about Sepia's abilities, he needed to increase her trust in him. But he also understood that if he made a wrong move or took the wrong action, He could easily die just like Victor. He began to think about Sepia's second personality and wanted to learn more about it. He began to consider the possibility of asking her about it right now. Walking ahead and gathering his courage, Dio addressed Sepia by name. Then he turned toward her and said that he wanted to tell her something very important. Sepia in turn looked intently at her savior, Dio. He asked her if she was a heretic who denied the true faith. Sepia was shocked by this question and her trust level instantly dropped by 5 points. Meanwhile, the action continues in the Holy Kingdom of Ultra, in the Ultra Cathedral. Priestess Clara then returned to where she was headed. She was greeted with the remark that she had traveled a long way. She agreed with his words as it was indeed true. Then the man decided to accompany Clara to her destination, while she marveled at the enormous size of the cathedral they were in. When they reached the right place, the man told her that she must remember and watch her actions, even though she had been trained. Clara was slightly frightened to hear such words directed at her, but nevertheless said that she would try to be careful. And so she entered the enormous room where a man was waiting for her, sitting on a throne in the middle of the hall. Clara knelt down and greeted the noble moon that was right in front of her. In response to Clara's greeting, she asked her to raise her head. It was Saint Kalena Luna, who noted the length of Clara's journey to this place. Clara raised her head and once again greeted the noble saint of the Church of the Moon. She asked Clara if she knew why she had been invited here, saying that she knew about her visit to the Forgotten Temple. Then Kalena Luna asked Clara to tell her the story of her journey. She needed to know what Clara had seen, heard, and experienced while there. Without hesitation, Clara told the Holy Luna everything about that day. At one point, her story was interrupted before she could finish. Then Luna noted that Clara had done well and that her actions and devotion to the church had been of great benefit. She said that Luna's blessing would continue to light her way and that the parish would give her a fitting reward. Clara was happy to hear this and thanked Luna, expressing words of praise for her and the endless moon. After Clara left the room, Lady Luna called a man named Full to her. Full Eppenhouse was the Archbishop of the Church of the Moon who had come without making the moon wait. She began the conversation by saying that Clara's sister had probably told them the truth. But there was one thing, and this strange moment for them was the realization that the name Monty was fictitious. She ordered a message to be sent to River North to keep an eye on him. Meanwhile, our hero's journey to River North continued, and Sepia tried to figure out why Dio thought she was a heretic. After all, in her opinion, such people were definitely those who had kidnapped her, but not her. But Dio replied that heretics have something in common that unites them all. And that thing was not a desire for faith, but for absolute power. After all, he had never seen the power that Sepia had demonstrated before. He explained her power by comparing it to the manifestation of chaos and aggression. Sepia, upon hearing this, realized that she had not trusted Dio all this time, but now she herself was under suspicion. After all, she herself had no answer for Dio on this matter. And then she thought that there was a possibility that Dio was an inquisitor of the Church of the Moon, judging by the skills he had shown her. She decided to tell him everything as it was, starting with her childhood, when she often lost consciousness because she couldn't control her power. She explained that the magicians had not diagnosed her, but it was definitely not a demonic power because when she used magic, fire and light appeared. When Dio heard about the light Sepia had mentioned, he had an interesting thought about it. He immediately remembered the vision he had seen when he signed the contract with Sepia. And then the thought occurred to him that Sepia possessed divine power. Sepia tried to explain to Dio that her power, even when it was out of control, had never caused anyone the slightest harm. Dio became curious as to why she was telling him everything so obediently, and thought that his behavior might have frightened her greatly. Sepia immediately turned to him with a question that interested her. She looked away and told Dio that, in her opinion, he was an inquisitor of the Church of the Moon. But Dio immediately began to justify himself, saying that he was just a mercenary as he had told her earlier. Looking at Dio, she noted that he looked like a man from the East, but Dio couldn't have known that because for Kim Jun, he was just a character. Dio explained that even if he were from the East, it would not mean that he was an inquisitor of the Church of the Moon, because he did not like such people. He knew that these people had enormous power and were called the first followers of the moon, and they were all very pedantic. Their pedantry lay in the fact that if they suspected someone of heresy for even a second, they would immediately draw their swords of justice. This is how Dio proved to Sepia that he was not an inquisitor, because he would have taken her life at the first sign of suspicion of her power. Then he suggested that she come up with something to say when they arrived in River North, as their journey was almost over. He meant that he did not want to tell Sepia's brother Sigmund about their contract for her release. Dio suggested telling Sigmund that Dio needed to treat Sepia and that she had to stay with him for that. Sepia said that this was a bad plan because her brother would never believe it and would definitely not let her go anywhere. In any case, Dio believed that this option was much better than telling Sigmund the whole truth about their subjugation. With her hand on her heart, Sepia asked Dio for one favor. She asked him to stop her brother Sigmund if he ever tried to follow her. After all, she didn't want her brother to lose his position and honor just to follow her. The information did not please Dio because if Sigmund went with them, it would definitely be to his advantage. But since Sepia had asked him, he couldn't refuse her request. As they drew closer, our heroes heard a strange sound coming from nearby. They saw horses and a banner belonging to the city of River North. Sepia ran towards them, overcome with joy, and Dio asked her not to run so fast. Sepia was running so fast with excitement that Dio thought he was about to fall. As they approached, Dio hoped he would be able to convince Sepia's brother, Sigmund, but Sigmund was approaching with absolute fury in his eyes. And in his eyes, one could see his intention to take Dio's life immediately without understanding the situation. Dio had no choice but to start defending himself. In order to smooth things over and resolve the situation, Dio asked Sigmund to stop, saying that he had misunderstood everything. But Sigmund didn't want to hear a word Dio said, and his intentions were extremely serious. Sepia watched in horror and was probably frightened. Dio realized that he had waited in vain for their help and understood that Sigmund's level was not yet high enough. Sigmund continued to attack, completely unaware of Dio's intentions. Seeing the technique Dio used, Sigmund found it quite interesting, but then suggested he watch his counterattack. But his attack was stopped in an instant by Sepia's sister, and he continued to glare at her with the same feelings of anger. She began to scold him for wanting to take his own life and his sister's as well. But Sigmund did not understand what his sister meant by her words. When Sepia realized that she had said too much, Dio also understood that it would take a very long time to explain everything to Sigmund. It wasn't long before their entire group entered River North. Once they arrived, Sepia and Dio couldn't think of anything better than to tell Sigmund that Dio was an Eastern healer. They said that they had managed to rid Sepia of the curse using Eastern techniques and, at the same time, had dealt with the villains. At that moment, Dio thought about how much work Sepia had done, but it was a necessary measure because they needed Sigmund to believe it. Finally, Sigmund apologized to the healer Dio for attacking him for no apparent reason. Dio realized that Sigmund's doubts could not simply be dispelled, because he asked if all the healers on his continent were like that, as his abilities were impressive. Dio explained that in order to protect himself while traveling, he had to be very strong, and added something else to clarify. He told Sigmund that Sepia had not yet managed to completely get rid of the curse. He explained that the mark on Sepia could not be completely cured by conventional methods. He then began to talk about himself as the best Eastern doctor who had crossed the sea to reach this place from afar. Even Sepia herself was taken aback by Dio's words. He said that in his hometown he had already encountered a curse like Sepia's, and it was called invisible poison. To cure it, it was necessary to constantly monitor the patient's condition, and to find the right medicine, they had to be always on the move. This was the reason why Sepia had to go on the journey with him. Hearing this, Sigmund was furious because he did not want to let Sepia go and said that he could find any ingredients on his own. Dio replied that any ingredients found must be used immediately, otherwise Sepia's condition could worsen, and finding them would be very difficult. He shouted that he couldn't let Sepia go and part with her again. Then Sepia herself joined the conversation, placing her hand on her brother's arm. She told her brother that she didn't mind going on a journey with Dio and promised that she would definitely return to Sigmund completely healthy. Sigmund told his sister to go rest while he talked to Mr. Dio the doctor alone. Sepia listened to her brother and was about to leave, saying that she had enjoyed having lunch with him after such a long separation. And so Sepia was about to leave, passing by her friend Dio. He grabbed her by the arm under the pretext of checking her pulse, asking her to continue pretending to be ill and not to wander around. Then he asked her to write a farewell letter to his younger brother, Sigmund. He then said that he would continue to monitor Sepia's health and would come to visit her a little later. And so, when they were left alone with Sigmund, he suggested that they drop the pretense of politeness between them. Sigmund told Dio that he could openly express his dissatisfaction if he had any. Coincidentally, Dio wanted to suggest the same thing to Sigmund. At that moment, Sigmund's expression changed and he became more serious, asking Dio who he really was. Dio realized that the answers he had given earlier were unlikely to satisfy Sigmund, and he understood that he needed to be a little more honest with him. He then revealed that he was using the name Dio and working as a mercenary to earn a living. Sigmund was curious if Dio was part of a mercenary guild, and he replied that he wanted to join River North. He then asked him why he should believe Dio was capable of lifting the curse. Dio couldn't tell him that his sister was already healthy but bound to him by an oath, so he repeated to Sigmund that he had done something similar before. Sigmund still didn't trust Dio's words and pointed out that he was still trying to get his way. Sigmund also pointed out that Dio had taken a great risk and asked him why he had saved Sepia. Dio did not understand why this question had become so burdensome for him, because when he answered it to Sepia, everything was much simpler. Then Dio finally found the strength to say that no reason was needed to save a person. Sigmund thought Dio looked suspicious and didn't know if he could trust him with his sister Sepia. Dio understood that the doubts were justified because, apart from the fact that he was stuck in the game as a 10th level character, he was unable to explain it to him. But then Sigmund reminded Dio that he had saved Sepia and knew about her curse, even though they had kept it a secret. He then asked him a question about his confidence that Dio could really cure Sepia. Dio explained that he was the only person on the continent capable of doing so, and that the Archbishop of the Church of the Moon could also do it. Upon hearing this, Sigmund clenched his fist in anger and said that he did not trust people like that. But it turned out that Dio had said this on purpose to test what he knew about his distrust of the church. And then Sigmund had only one choice left, either to side with the church or with Dio. Then Dio thought about making another move to ensure that the choice would definitely be in his favor. In order to win Sigmund's trust, Dio said that he could also help them solve the mystery of the disappearances in River North. But Sigmund did not understand this, believing that a stranger could not possess the information necessary to help them. When Dio stammered in response, Sigmund immediately lunged at him with his sword. Dio remained completely calm and told Sigmund, the deputy commander, to calm down. Then he said that it was clear from Sigmund's face that he was curious to know where Dio had gotten this information. Dio then explained that all paths of the missing persons led to the back alleys of the criminal world of River North. Then Dio asked Sigmund where the search for his sister Sepia had begun. Dio was sure that even now those places were in complete chaos, as he had heard about the dominance of an influential criminal gang. Sigmund sarcastically remarked that Dio was very good at telling stories he had heard somewhere. Since Dio knew that Sigmund didn't trust him, he decided to show him his abilities, which Sigmund clearly didn't believe in. Dio definitely had some kind of plan because he said he was a great planner and had a plan to clean up the back alleys. After hearing Dio's plan, Sigmund noted that his idea was well thought out and asked him if he had really visited River North for the first time. Dio asked him to trust him, as he had no intention of doing anything bad, having been a doctor in his youth, where he learned how to use information. What Dio said obviously made Sigmund think seriously about the matter. What made Sigmund think was that he didn't understand what Dio wanted and suspected that he needed information. He reasoned that even if Dio had heard about everything while in other cities, he was unlikely to know about Sigmund's conflict with criminal. The fact was that this conflict had been troubling Sigmund for a very long time, and he really wanted Dio to be able to deal with them. Then Sigmund made a decision and realized that he needed to have Dio followed. Dio was heading to the market and realized that nothing had changed since he had been there while playing the game. This place appears if you walk along a busy shopping street, and this place was the entrance to the territory of those very criminals. Although Dio remembered every possible quest in this place, he realized that, in reality, this place seemed much scarier. In this dangerous world, there were two main groups, the first of which was called the Moderate Golden Dawn. The second criminal group was called the Radical Bloody Battle. If you follow the story, the Bloody Battle seized power in the criminal world of River North, but they were defeated by Sigmund, who was furious over the death of Sepia. Now, Sepia was completely healthy, and Sigmund would not turn the world upside down, so Dio did not know how the story would unfold. However, he also thought that finding the answer to this question would not be difficult at all. He knew that the bloody war had been suppressed by the Golden Dawn, only because the latter had suffered heavy losses from Sigmund's actions. And now Dio was back at the starting point. Dio approached Ludens, who represented the Golden Dawn, and told him that the deputy commander had apologized to them. After that, Dio said that Sigmund no longer intended to touch their group. Dio understood that even after suffering huge losses, Ludens would greet him with a smile on his face. After all, it was not for nothing that this man was the leader of the moderate faction, but that did not change the fact that he was a criminal. Agreeing that they would live in peace from now on, they parted on a friendly note. This was Dio's plan, and with that, his preparations for the operation were complete. He had one more step to take in his plan. Now he needed the NPC inventory that the game's inhabitants possessed. Suddenly, evil werewolves that looked like wolves began to attack Dio again. Undoubtedly, he was able to easily deal with them without spending much time on it. He understood that even though he had increased his skill level with the fire substance he had taken from the inventory, nothing seemed to have changed. Then other monsters whose heads resembled rats began to attack him. To fight them off, he used his explosion skill again. Then someone approached him from behind and asked Dio if he was okay, addressing him as Sir. It was Father Krypus, to whom Dio explained that he had increased his fire resistance with the salamander armor set, and that he was fine. Father Krypus was impressed by Dio's strength, and believed that his power was now capable of breaking even his holy shield. Krypus is a priest of the Church of the Moon, and Dio met him on his way out after enlisting as a mercenary and accepting a quest. But then the system notified him of the start of a quest to destroy monsters in the River North sewers. The priest thanked Dio for his help in completing the church's research mission, and Dio said that thanks to him, he was able to finish faster. When there were no monsters left, they politely said goodbye and Dio went on his way. The priest said a blessing, saying that Dio would be granted the strength and mercy of the moon. But the priest was not so simple, for he was carrying out the archbishop's task of finding Dio, who had given himself away as Monte. When Dio arrived at the territory of the next criminal gang, everyone immediately realized that the man standing before them was the one who had been in the Golden Dawn. Dio, however, was not at all surprised by how quickly rumors spread in this place. They began to approach him, saying that, in their opinion, Dio was behaving too relaxed and recklessly. Bearing their swords before Dio, they reminded him aloud that all these guys were members of the Bloody Howl gang. Dio thought that such a meeting was even to his advantage because he had already planned to reach level 90 and could do so by defeating them. Then Dio said that he intended to meet with their leader. He added that it would be great if their conversation went faster once he had defeated them. And so they rushed into battle straight toward Dio, who was not averse to a fight. Dio instantly scattered all the attackers in different directions, and one of them crawled over to help his boss. He told his boss about Dio as a guy who had come at the Golden Dawn. It wasn't long before Dio found himself behind the man who had been complaining to his leader. Throwing the guy aside, he thanked him for bringing Dio to the boss of their company. The leader of this group looked at Dio and asked if he was the guy from the eastern continent that Sigmund had brought. He tried to find out what had brought Dio to them, noting that he had arrived at the Golden Dawn first. Dio explained that he had come because Sigmund had asked him to clean up the back alleys. The leader of that group laughed out loud because he couldn't believe that Sigmund had decided to solve the problem with the help of a stranger. Then his expression changed and he became serious in an instant, clarifying that the reason Dio had come here was to declare a real battle. But Dio explained that this was not the case at all, as there was a completely different reason for his visit. But the leader of the Bloody Pack did not expect to hear such a response from Dio and froze for a moment, waiting for an explanation. Dio asked the leader of the group to listen to him carefully, for Sigmund had indeed asked him for a favor. Dio then explained that he was not just a henchman, but a person of a different caliber. Then, spreading his arms wide, he shouted that the reason for his appearance here was his desire to unite them. Apparently, their group did not like this plan, and their leader ordered them to draw their weapons against Dio. When arrows flew at Dio, he caught one flying straight at him. Dio immediately began to reason that there were 3 ranged fighters in front of him, and only 20 fighters in total. Then he decided to recall his forgotten fencing skills. He then began to use a slashing technique in their battle. In an instant, everyone realized that they were not facing just a swordsman, but a swordsman with magic. After realizing this, everyone was ordered not to approach him, as they could not fight him that way. In less than a second, Dio found himself right in front of one of them. Without wasting any time, he immediately delivered his strongest blow. Dio noted that their screams were completely useless. Then he asked the leader of their group how long he intended to just stand there and continue watching. Dio continued, saying that if they continued in the same vein, he would be forced to kill all of his subordinates. These words were the last straw for the leader of the Bloody Howling, and he ordered everyone to get out of the way so that he could deal with them all himself. And so he began to attack while Dio resisted him. The leader also noted that with Dio's abilities, he would hardly be able to defeat him. Dio understood that his opponent was probably stronger than Sigmund, but he definitely had a plan. The opponent was surprised that Dio managed to block his attack, but Dio noted that this was precisely the power of the unique 100th level equipment. Dio looked confidently at his opponent and understood perfectly well that it was all thanks to the artifact. According to the game, items of unique type and above are artifacts and are treated as valuable items. The female leader of the Bloody Howl noted that even with such an artifact, Dio would not be able to defeat her. After Dio said that this would be more than enough for him, he struck the leader of the Bloody Howl. Dio had a unique set consisting of 6 different items. If you looked at it just once, you couldn't call it ordinary. And because this set increases strength by 150, it compensates for the difference in levels between Dio and the leader. Dio noticed how quickly the leader of the Bloody Howl was recovering, and then Dio realized that despite the artifacts he had, he was still in danger. Dio continued to launch rapid attacks on his opponent. Then he suggested that his opponent, the criminal, get some sleep first. That's exactly what he did, leaning back and falling asleep completely drained of strength. Dio turned to the remaining members of the group and told them to stay quiet if they wanted to save their boss's life. Then Dio exhaled, thinking about how much stronger he had become thanks to his ability to defeat such a serious opponent. Then he began to push such thoughts away because he really still had a long way to go. Suddenly, he caught himself thinking that he had missed Raymond during that time. Raymond was the first person Dio had managed to befriend in the game. Then he began to think that Raymond was probably doing well. But in reality, Raymond's situation was not so good because he was screaming and asking for help. At that moment, Raymond was being held captive by Lady Scarlet. She came and asked her subordinates if they had managed to find out anything from Raymond. They immediately replied that Raymond had given them all the information they needed with just a little effort. They managed to find out that after the defenders repelled the wave of monsters in Avra, Dio left in an unknown direction, and that was all he knew. Judging by what the coachman told them on the way to River North, he had suddenly asked to be dropped off on the Paramount Plains. Scarlet then replied that even though Dio's men were now in their hands, they remained loyal to him. After that, Scarlet said that she considered the loyalty of mercenaries to be simply worthless and meaningless. She explained to Raymond that even if he continued to defend his ideals, suffering and pain would ultimately be inevitable. Then a man appeared behind Miss Scarlet, intending to tell her something important. He handed her a letter saying that a carrier pigeon had arrived from Atra. It said that a suspicious mercenary with low skills and rank, but skilled in dissection, had been discovered in River North. Scarlet realized that Monty, whom they were looking for, had the same abilities. As soon as she realized this, she was struck by the thought that it was the same man. She ordered all her men to head to River North, but first to get rid of the captive Raymond. Raymond screamed, reminding them of their promise to spare his life if he told them everything he knew, but they had no intention of keeping their word. When the leader of the Bloody Howl came to her senses, she was curious why Dio had not taken her life, since he had the opportunity to do so. But Dio reminded her again that he had come to them only to talk, and certainly not to destroy their criminal gang. Expressing her willingness to talk, the gang leader still asked what Dio wanted and what his intentions were. Dio repeated that Sigmund wanted peace, and that he was only there to unite the opposing groups, but he also added that he really didn't like having to work so hard. He meant that if he managed to unite the two criminal groups, he would have to become their leader. And that was why Dio said that the leader of the Bloody Howl would take care of it instead of him. The woman's eyes widened when Dio said that he had offered the same thing to the Golden Dawn, but they didn't like it. After all, according to Dio, they were only pretending to be good but could betray him at the wrong moment. And that's why Dio liked the leader of the Bloody Howl more, which is what he told her. He said he would tell Sigmund that he had united the two groups, but in reality, she would be in charge. After all, by taking the throne of the criminal world of River North, her long-held dream would come true. The leader of the group called Task has been part of the Bloody War for 10 years. She remembers that things used to be completely different, and this place was filled with criminals who were just trying to survive. And Task was the one who united all the criminals by demonstrating her overwhelming power. But she also had charisma and leadership qualities that helped her unite all this chaos. Dio told her that if she did as he said, she could become the queen of the River North criminal world. With a smile from ear to ear and absolute trust in Dio, she accepted his offer. But not everyone was happy about this, as they believed that their leader had fallen for the tricks of a stranger. Dio's first task was to place explosive devices throughout the city and then detonate them. After the guys from the Golden Dawn ran out, thinking that a raid had begun, it would be necessary to deal with them because they would already be weak. Regarding the guards and knights, Dio explained that they would not stop them and would probably help because everything would look completely different. Everything will look as if a bloody battle prevented the Dawn from detonating the bombs, thereby saving many citizens. And Dio explained that in this way, she would not only gain authority but also power in the criminal world. Someone from the crowd shouted that they should not trust Dio because this plan seemed extremely absurd. But the leader Task did not listen to him and ordered him to be quiet. She ordered everyone to reconsider because if Dio was lying, he could take the life of absolutely everyone there, and he had the means to do so. Dio, feeling the man's gaze on him, watched his reaction with a smirk as he received further instructions. That same man was extremely annoyed by his leader's excessive trust in someone he didn't know. That same evening, there was a confident knock on Sepia's door, and she opened it after asking who was there. Dio was standing there, having come to check on Sepia under the pretext that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Sepia told him that she felt unwell when Dio was far away from her and was worried about the heaviness she felt in her heart. Dio explained that now they should not leave each other and should always move together. He then told her that he would soon finish all his planned business in River North. Therefore, he asked Sepia to pack her things in advance and say goodbye to everyone. She listened to him and said she would try to do so. Dio saw how upset Sepia was and felt awkward because he didn't know how to comfort her. Then he decided to find some words of comfort and, placing his hand on her head, said that he would try to make up for the dinner on the way. He also promised to show her the best view of the sky in River North before they left. Later, they met with Deputy Commander Sigmund, and Dio couldn't figure out how to start a conversation with him. Then he decided to start by thanking Sigmund for waiting for him while he talked to his sister Sepia. But Sigmund was serious and said that if Dio did anything wrong, he would lose his head in an instant. He told Dio that he had been watching his every move in action for a week. He explained that it was all truly surprising because he hadn't bothered the criminals but had suddenly joined the ranks of mercenaries. The next question for Dio was about the reasons for his visit to the sewers, and he thought that he needed money. Sigmund didn't say anything about the other reasons, but he thought that going to the Bloody War was extremely dangerous. And then Dio realized that Sigmund was only worried about his sister because no one knew what would happen to her if Dio disappeared. But Dio reassured him and said that everything would be fine, but that Sigmund needed to give some instructions to his knights. It turned out that Dio wanted Sigmund to capture the Bloody Warrior while they thought the knights were on their side. But the thing was, the knights had to be brought there exactly 1 hour after the signal, so they could wait until dawn to start the fight. But the deputy commander did not yet understand what signal Dio meant. Dio said that the signal for the 1-hour countdown would naturally be the explosion that Dio loved so much. 4 days later, the decisive day of battle arrived. All these days in River North, everything was quite calm and peaceful. But behind the scenes, preparations for the decisive battle were in full swing. The leader of the Bloody Howl task said that they had laid explosives throughout the area, and now all they had to do was wait. After all, the planned explosion was set to occur at exactly 12 o'clock today. Everyone was happy that they now had an ally with the same goal as them, and their dream of uniting criminals had come true. They had always dreamed of defeating the Golden Dawn, but Sigmund had caused them a lot of trouble in achieving this goal. For them, the appearance of a guy from the Eastern continent who could figure everything out was a blessing. There wasn't much time left until the planned time, and Task looked out the window in anticipation. At that moment, they had an extremely strange and disturbing premonition. Task sensed the approaching danger and, as a representative of the warrior people of the North, could not ignore it. At some point, it dawned on her, and she suddenly realized something painfully obvious. At some point, she opened the lid that was right next to them. When she opened it, she saw explosives that were seconds away from detonating. Task sincerely did not understand why these items were here. There, she also saw a note left by Dio, saying that it would be interesting to see how powerful the explosion would be. When the seconds on the timer ran out, there was a powerful explosion. Everything around them lit up with the bright lights of firework. All the residents watched and marveled at the beauty, realizing that their master cared about them because today was not a holiday. Sepia watched the stunning fireworks display from her window. Dio, meanwhile, was relaxing and thinking about the gullibility of the bloody howling, not understanding why they had set off so many explosives. After all, Dio had to spend the entire night replacing all the bombs with fireworks, but he understood that despite all his efforts, they were not in vain. Then a fire was discovered, which the residents believed was caused by the fireworks. At that very moment, an alert came from the system that Dio had managed to defeat the boss of the Bloody Howl, gaining a lot of experience points, which made Dio happy. Dio knew that the other members of the group, unaware of what had happened to their boss, would want to take revenge on Golden Dawn. That's exactly what happened, and they immediately rushed in, taking Ludens by surprise. At that moment, the system announced that the mission to clear the back alleys had been successfully completed and that the River North Knight medal had been awarded as a reward. An hour had passed since the explosion, and Dio was sure that the River North Knights would take care of the rest. And so it happened, because the team of knights led by Sigmund did not keep him waiting long and followed the plan. Then Dio realized that it was time to go after Sepia and leave while her brother was busy. He had to do it as soon as possible, because if they saw each other again, there was a chance she might change her mind and make the wrong choice. Sepia, meanwhile, thought that this was probably the gift that Mr. Dio had told her about. She held onto the window and thought about how she really needed to leave the city. Suddenly, she heard another insistent knock on her door. It was very strange because she was sure she had locked the door. As she approached the door, someone was sneaking up behind her. When it was over, Sigmund was surprised that everything had worked out as Dio had planned, although he didn't want to admit it. Sigmund was then convinced of Dio's abilities and thought that the best solution would be to let Sepia go with him. Suddenly, someone interrupted Sigmund's thoughts, shouting his name as if something terrible had happened. It turned out that a strange glow had been detected around Ludens' lifeless body. Sigmund realized that this haze resembled the aura emanating from demons. And when he realized that Sepia might be in danger, he gave the order to return immediately. When Dio came for Sepia, he found her in great danger. He was met by the boss of the Golden Dawn, who kindly invited Dio to come in. Dio didn't understand what was happening because everything was going according to plan. For Dio, this turn of events was surprising because even when he was a player, Ludens always died. He knew that in the game, he was a man who had strengthened the Golden Dawn's position not with force but with skill, and after Sigmund's awakening, he would disappear. And then Dio realized that Ludens most likely had a secret that had not yet been revealed in history. The energy he radiated when they first met was very different from what Dio sees before him now. Now he was aggressive and extremely irritated, with a look of rage in his eyes. Dio realized that what Ludens had shown him earlier was simply a game or a kind of mask, and asked him what he wanted from Dio. Ludens replied that he had a specific matter to discuss with Mr. Dio. With a single snap of his fingers, he sealed the room so that no one could enter, and Dio realized that he was facing a magician. Dio didn't know if he could defeat Ludens, not knowing the limits of his power, and especially since Sepia was now in his hands, and he had to be careful. But Dio had no other choice, and he thrust his sword straight at Ludens' face and hit his target. He delivered several blows that would have killed anyone else, but not Ludens, and Dio realized this after many attempts. But Dio managed to grab Sepia, buying himself some time, and directed his sword toward his opponent. All the wounds Dio inflicted on Ludens healed before his eyes, and he noted that Dio understood everything very quickly and behaved like an experienced fighter. Then Ludens asked Dio to notice that he was a vampire. Dio's fighting power did not impress Ludens, and he thought that the problem was clearly in his equipment. And Dio thought that there really was a problem with this, because he compensated for his weak characteristics with his equipment. Dio was blunt and asked Ludens to lend him a silver stake. Dio was curious about what Ludens was trying to prove to him, as he didn't understand it at all yet. But without giving Dio any answer, he began to attack him. Ludens attacked as if he had been reborn as someone else. Ludens noted that Dio was holding his own quite well, but it was a pity that this was all he was capable of. But at a certain point, Dio realized what he had to do next. It was silver that Dio was able to throw directly at Ludens. It turned out that a silver candlestick had flown into Ludens' head. Dio said that he had planned to simply decapitate Ludens with the candlestick, but he was probably lucky. It was Dio's plan to deliberately wait for the right moment to counterattack. Ludens replied that such tactics were very effective against slow opponents. Dio realized that if the silver candlestick didn't work, things were getting serious and he had no chance of winning. Ludens suddenly and unexpectedly said that Dio had passed. But Dio responded indignantly, saying that Ludens didn't know him well enough to say that. Narrowing his eyes, he said that he knew very well who was standing before him. Dio was extremely surprised when he heard Ludens call him a forgotten swordsman. Sepia was still lying on the floor completely exhausted, and Ludens asked Dio why he was so surprised by those words. After all, he had said that Dio knew who Ludens was, and Ludens knew perfectly well who Dio was. Dio thought that he was facing a character with a hidden class, and that he had many opportunities to establish his identity. It turned out that Ludens had been a vampire for thousands of years, and thanks to his long life, he had become the head of the clan. Dio pondered his status as a vampire lord, as he was sure that he was just a vampire and then realized that this was serious. This realization meant only one thing. Ludens' level was no less than 350. This meant that if he had fought at full strength, Dio would no longer be alive, and therefore the clan was hiding in River North. Ludens explained that he was the only vampire hiding in this city. This land has a long history spanning thousands of years, and according to Ludens, Dio may have gained his power when he saw a fresco depicting this history. After that, the system indicated the presence of a quest where a meeting with a character who knows the entire story takes place, and all the information must be uncovered. He was shocked because he realized that he could learn the story of the Forgotten Swordsman right now. Of course, he shouted to Ludens that he wanted to learn more about the power of the Forgotten Swordsman. Ludens explained that the story began thousands of years ago in a divine era. Currently, the only god worshipped by humans is Luna, who was the goddess of the moon. But in the past, different gods could give people knowledge, and there was a god who was stronger than the moon. And this god was their sun, which Ludens spoke about with complete seriousness. Then he showed a mark on his hand that symbolized this. Dio suddenly remembered that he had seen this symbol before on the golden armor of the warriors who had come to him in a vision when he saved Sepia. A logical question arose in Dio's mind. Why couldn't the sun oppose the moon god if he was stronger? But Ludens couldn't reveal this information, nor the name of the sun god, because the current world is under the control of the moon. Then Ludens said that he did not know what would happen to Dio if anyone found out that the sun god had given him these powers. But when he understood what was being said, he was shocked, because it was the first time he had heard about this divine power. When Dio asked Ludens to explain everything in more detail, he said that he had already explained it as much as possible. Then Ludens asked Dio if he knew anything about the sacred war of the divine era. Then the Demon King led his demonic monsters and invaded the human world, while the sun and moon joined forces to defend it. However, the moon was too jealous of the sun and eventually wiped the sun off the face of the earth. This sounded extremely arrogant, but Dio understood that the meaning was that the Church of the Moon had betrayed the Church of the Sun. Ludens continued that in order to erase all records related to the sun, the moon got rid of all followers of the Church of the Sun. It turned out that Ludens was not the only follower hiding from the moon's eyes. But he also said that all children of the sun were cursed, and the followers of the moon had borrowed the power of demons for this purpose. This curse was the inability to live or die and instead become a demon. Finally, he realized that Adelia Dark was also a follower of the sun, which is why he had received the power of the sun. Ludens noted that Dio had finally understood something correctly. It turned out that not only he possessed the power of the sun, but also the sleeping Sepia. He remembered the manifestation of the power of the sun in Sepia that day and realized that it was her he had seen then. Dio was surprised because he had thought her power was just some kind of amazing gift. Then Ludens confessed that he had come to River North and kidnapped Sepia only because he did not know that Dio would be there. Dio reflected on how he had always believed that he was creating his own path and moving forward along it. But after learning all this information, he began to wonder if all his encounters and choices had been the will of the sun god. Meanwhile, Scarlet looked out the window and thought about how noisy River North was. And the priest of the Moon Church noted that he himself had never seen the city in such a state before. She ordered him to write down his thoughts on the matter in his report. She asked about Dio's whereabouts and was told that he had last been seen with Sigmund. She became curious about their relationship and was told that this had not yet been clarified. She had heard that many people said that the River North Knights had more influence than the Moon Church. Then she was told that Sigmund was known to everyone as a knight of great honor and conviction. She said that she would be quite curious to destroy all his beliefs and that she would have many new toys. Then Scarlet began to rise and ordered the priest to begin preparations. First, she planned to look at the face of Sigmund's deputy commander. Meanwhile, Dio thought about the possible reason why he was locked in this game connected to the local gods. Ludens glanced aside and said that Sepia's brother had appeared. On that note, Ludens suggested they end their conversation on that topic. The seal on the room was removed and Sigmund could be heard ordering a search of the entire house to find Sepia. Ludens said that Dio would find out the answers to all his questions in time. First, he advised Dio to meet with his close friend by going to the Estelle rooms. Ludens began to fade into space and said that he wanted Dio to continue following the path of the sun without doubting it. As he left, he said that their sun would surely rise again. Ludens dissolved into the air and disappeared at the exact moment when Sigmund burst into the room. He was shocked to see Sepia and Dio and wondered what had happened to the room. He looked around and wondered what had happened here. In the end, the situation took a completely unexpected turn. He realized that it would not be easy to get out of this situation, because he had become an accomplice of a representative of the demon race, and that guy had simply run away. When Sigmund approached Dio's cell, Dio asked him to get him out of there. The prison guard started yelling that Dio had no right to talk to Sigmund like that, but he was asked to leave and leave them alone. Dio was sure that he was being treated unfairly and told the deputy commander about it. He apologized to Dio for putting him in custody, explaining that it was a necessary measure because they were being watched by many eyes. Sigmund explained that their situation had become much worse than before, but Dio tried to convey that he had no connection to the demon race. Sigmund told him that a representative of the moon had come to see them, and Dio was surprised by this. The thing was that the representatives of the moon were trying to find a man named Monty here, and she was interested in him, including Dio and everything related to him. They demanded that Sepia be interrogated because she was at the scene of the incident, but Sigmund refused. Dio thought that if Ludent's words were to be believed, there were no places left on this continent that were not under the moon's control. Sigmund was worried that if they interrogated Sepia, they might sense her power, and then she would be in danger. Then Sigmund said that he still did not fully trust Dio. He then broke the lock on the camera and said that Dio was now his only option. When Dio asked him what he planned to do next, Sigmund replied that there was no time left and that he would try to stop them. At that moment, Sigmund's subordinates called him, reporting that representatives of the Church of the Moon were there. He replied that he was already on his way and would arrive any minute. Before leaving, Sigmund told Dio that Sepia was in his room. As he left, he ordered him to take Sepia and leave River North immediately. Dio understood that he would do anything for his sister, but it was unclear whether he would be able to stand up to the Inquisitors. The thing was, throughout the game, he had believed that the Church of the Moon was always an allied faction. But now the circumstances had changed, and the Church of the Moon was his enemy, and this thought alone filled Dio with anxiety and fear. The Knights of the Moon, praising their church, ordered a search of the entire area around River North. The Knights of that city responded to this insolence by saying that they could never forgive such audacity and disrespect. But suddenly Scarlet intervened and spoke of forgiveness. She said that they had no right to behave in such a manner toward a holy representative, but they tried to explain to her that they had no right to enter their territory without permission from their commander, River Norton. Scarlet didn't even bother to listen and, drawing her weapon, instantly punished those who resisted. She said that if they handed over Sigmund's younger sister and the mercenary from the eastern continent, everything would be resolved peacefully. She gave them a condition. If they refused, she would instantly kill everyone who stood in her way. Scarlet was undoubtedly behaving rudely, and her behavior and words created a tense atmosphere. At that moment, the deputy manager appeared among them and forbade anyone to move without his order. Approaching them, he ordered that everyone standing before him be punished. She looked at Sigmund with tenderness, saying that he was the famous knight. He explained that in the absence of the commander, he was acting in his stead. Sigmund said that before taking someone's life, they must first be convicted, which they had not done. They were talking about the soldier who had been killed, and Scarlet explained that the trial had taken place instantly when he had decided to block her path. Behind Sigmund, everyone was shouting that Scarlet was lying because everything had happened right before their eyes. He showed them the back of his hand, signaling that everyone should be quiet. Sigmund explained to Scarlet that he would not tolerate violence on his territory, as the church had only been allowed to move after the investigation was complete. But Scarlet was very cunning and could clearly see that Sigmund was deliberately hiding Dio and Sepia on his property. Sigmund explained that his sister was only a victim and had nothing to do with the incident. Unfortunately for Sigmund, he was unable to calm Scarlet down. After Scarlet's attack, Sigmund was slightly injured by her sword. Scarlet explained that she absolutely hated waiting for what she wanted. Scarlet noticed that Sigmund was able to dodge her sudden attack and concluded that the rumors about him were probably true. She also thought that such a skilled knight would be capable of attacking in return, but for some reason did not do so. But Sigmund did not even touch his sword at that moment. She looked at him and tried to figure out how he had managed to obtain such a position despite his humble origins. He kindly replied that his skills were nothing compared to Lady Scarlet, who was like a scarlet rose of the goddess. She was amazed by his gentlemanly manners combined with his abilities. And of course, after these words, she began to attack Sigmund. Scarlet concluded that if Sigmund did not show his abilities to her, he would automatically acknowledge her. She told him that if he had no intention of resisting her, there was no point in wasting time, and that they should end it all quickly. But Sigmund replied that he was just being extremely cautious. Sigmund began to think to himself that there was no need for a radical investigation if it was all about yesterday's events. He thought about how traces of demons had been spotted in River North only yesterday, but Scarlet had arrived there much earlier. Sigmund asked Scarlet to clarify, as she had said that the church's goal was to interrogate his sister and the mercenary. He also clarified that the real reason and goal was a mercenary named Monty. She agreed because she believed that Monty was connected to the incident, and that the investigation related to the demons was truly less important. And that is why Scarlet regarded Sigmund's actions as a cover-up for those people. He then replied that, as expected, there had been a misunderstanding. He said he didn't know anyone named Monty and that the man who had been detained didn't look like him either. She looked at him but seemed to believe his words. But what surprised her was that he was willing to defend his beliefs at the cost of his life, with knightly pride and for the safety of his family. And then Scarlet thought that all of this had to be destroyed anyway. But then the fighters who had come with Scarlet informed her that the suspect had probably escaped. Some time ago, Dio was indignant that Sigmund had not offered any help other than opening the door for him. After all, the layout of that dungeon was so confusing that escape seemed impossible, but Dio was lucky because he had played there before. He remembered a trick that could be used in the cell on the left. If he moved one object in that cell, a trapdoor would open, allowing him to escape. As Dio had expected, he found himself outside the knight's residence. He climbed out just as the knights of the Holy Kingdom were searching the place. According to Sigmund, Sepia was on the 4th floor of the villa. And since Sigmund was the only one who knew about his escape, he had to be extremely careful not to show himself to either side. He understood that he couldn't abandon Sepia in trouble and also noted that the difficulty level in this game was quite high. Dio decided to look through his inventory to find something that could help him rescue Sepia. He noticed some elixirs with different properties and thought about them. He looked at it and realized that this was what he needed for this difficult task. He picked up a transformation potion that could turn a person into any object for 10 minutes. The maid met Dio in a different body when he entered the building. She addressed him using the name Ted, noting that they had not seen each other for a long time. He replied that he was on his way to Sepia on the orders of Master Sigmund. Dio sent the real Ted to rest from his duties in the backyard of the building. Ted said he needed to deliver medicine to Sepia, and the maid pointed to the door where Sepia was. He knocked on Sepia's door and said he had a message from her brother, Mr. Sigmund. Sepia timidly opened the door as if she did not trust anyone after the recent events. Ted abruptly opened the door and told Sepia that they had little time, scaring her to death. When the potion's effect wore off, Dio returned to his own body. He told Sepia that he had been arrested by force and that if they were caught, they would be declared heretics. Dio said he would explain everything to her later, but now they had to run. He held out his hand to her, asking if she trusted him. She hesitated for a moment, but then placed her hand in Dio's palm. Then Dio took out another potion and poured it over Sepia to turn her into stone for 10 minutes. He placed the statue of the petrified Sepia in his inventory so that he could transport her there when they escaped. Dio had already practiced this with a monster he had brought to the settlement and freed. He discovered this secret while testing an inventory character. Dio overheard someone talking about where the suspect might have gone. Now that both suspects had disappeared, the Holy Knights and the Knights of the Order raised an alarm. But Dio hoped that Sigmund would take care of it. After escaping from the villa with Sepia in his inventory, their journey continued. Their first stop was in Estelme, in the city of Neji, where they needed to find a good friend of Ludin's. The story of Sepia and her brother Sigmund began when they were forced to grow up without parents and survive as best they could in harsh conditions. They constantly had to endure cruelty from the local scum and knights who turned a blind eye to crime and idle aristocrats. In the back alleys of River Nord, which had a bad reputation, Sepia learned an important lesson. That lesson was that people never show kindness without a clear motive. Once, she was almost lured into human trafficking by an old man who approached her and pretended to be a true gentleman. There was also another man who pretended to be a respectable nobleman who wanted to use her to sell harmful, illegal substances. And that is why Sepia learned not to trust anyone but her own brother, Sigmund. She adhered to these principles until the moment she met Dio. And her principles regarding trust are shattered when Dio is around. Looking at him, she began to think that she might have been wrong all this time for not trusting anyone. When Sepia was released from the inventory and came to her senses, Dio told her to be careful because the petrification had only just ended. But Sepia was very upset, realizing that she was now far away from her brother and only causing Dio inconvenience. She kept telling herself that she couldn't just accept help and that she couldn't remain weak forever. Dio noticed that Sepia was behaving very strangely and thought it was a side effect of the petrification. Then she pulled herself together and told Dio that she wanted to become stronger. She shouted that she dreamed of becoming stronger so that she wouldn't have to depend on anyone's help. She asked him if there was a chance she could become as strong as him if she followed him. Dio replied that it was definitely possible, but that there would be many difficulties that would be far more serious than anything she had experienced before. She said she was ready to try and promised not to give up or cry. Dio understood that if Sepia managed to become stronger, it would also be much easier for him. He knew that he couldn't refuse Sepia's determination, even though Sigmund had asked him to keep an eye on her. To begin with, Dio decided to tell Sepia about the situation they had found themselves in due to fate and certain events. Sepia was not stupid and understood everything at once, even that Ludens had helped them learn more about Sepia's power. She thanked Dio for keeping the promise he had made to her brother, and for not simply leaving, even though he had had a perfect opportunity to do so. But Sepia was upset that she had not been able to say goodbye to her brother properly. Dio reassured her, telling her that they would definitely meet again, even though he wasn't sure about that himself. Then Dio said he would give Sepia a weapon she could use on her own. It was a unique type of crystal bow that required 5th level strength to use. Dio told her that this artifact would allow her to use the weapon, even if she had very little strength. Dio looked at her and realized that there was no better weapon for developing strength and agility than a bow. He understood that if he was to believe Ludens, Sepia was more of a mage than a fighter, but in order to use it freely, she needed accuracy. Dio reasoned that it would be best to give Sepia various tasks to teach her the basics, because beginners have unlimited potential. It wasn't long before Sepia's first task appeared. She drew her weapon and fired arrows one after another directly at her enemies. At that moment, she was in a tree and fired arrows directly from there. Her opponent seemed unaware of what was happening and where the attack was coming from. And then Sepia began to attack them from above, crouching down from a branch. The enemy, realizing what was happening, began to launch counterattacks. But all their attempts were in vain as Sepia easily defeated them. Turning to Dio, she repeated that she could handle everything herself. Dio praised her, but didn't know if he was doing everything right or if he had made a mistake somewhere. He was amazed at how quickly Sepia was learning and growing, probably because she was familiar with the basics of self-defense. Now Dio realized that it was foolish of him to consider Sepia fragile since she had never seen blood. He was surprised at how quickly she was learning what Dio was teaching her, but he actually liked it. And now, just 1 month after the start of their journey and training, her strength had grown incredibly. Sepia then told Dio that she intended to go and find out if there were any orcs left around. At that moment, Dio thought about how he could never have imagined that she could learn so quickly using only her physical abilities. But what surprised him most was the fact that she had never used the power of the sun, and if she did, she would be like a monster. However, Sepia did not yet understand how to control this power and probably did not use it for that reason. She used this power whenever they found themselves in extreme danger, simply by accident, without any intention. Dio opened Sepia's status window to see what changes had occurred in her during that time. He realized that since they met, her level had doubled, but her class was still unknown, and he began to think about how to reveal it. Suddenly, Dio noticed a bag under his feet that had apparently been dropped by the orcs. Next to the bag was a pickaxe, and Dio knew that orcs who lived in groups were farmers, which meant that these were indeed orcs. And then he realized that there was an orc cave nearby. Sepia had already returned by this point, and Dio suggested that she take a look inside the orc cave before they set off for Estellum. He then said that he intended to meet the witch there. The thing is, in the game world, witches are considered monsters and inhabitants of the game who are not involved in the main plot. Witches in ZGF come in different types: evil, heretics, and those who help players by giving them quests to complete. The Shadow Witch, who is currently nearby and lives in a cave, gives various items when defeated. However, this witch is a student of the Balance Witch, who is the strongest witch in the world and has far more knowledge than Dio. Therefore, Dio planned to learn information about Sepia's condition and strength from her. He then told Sepia that he intended to ask the Shadow Witch to examine her. Sepia had a logical question about whether they could fully trust that witch. Dio wasn't 100% sure about that, but he said that the witch really did know a lot of information that they needed. Another important fact was that witches couldn't stand fire. Therefore, Dio said that if a fight broke out between them, they would win in any case. Dio said that he had some means of calming Sepia down, so he asked her not to worry. And so our heroes, Sepia and Dio, arrived at the Hafner Valley. The raven that lives in the cave with the Shadow Witch has already arrived and informed his mistress about the guests who intend to visit her home. The raven also said that he considered these people to be enemies. She was even slightly pleased, saying that the harvest season had finally arrived, comparing her impending goal to potatoes. She immediately invited the orcs to her and they immediately appeared at her command. She ordered them to take everything the approaching guests had. She hoped that her guests had a lot of money. She dreamed of buying herself a chicken and eating 1 egg a day, as she hadn't eaten for several days. Sepia watched the surroundings and could not see anyone, neither witches nor orcs. Dio was sure that the Shadow Witch must already know about their arrival at this place. Then the orcs appeared, and Dio said that if they wanted to get to the witch, they had to deal with them first. Sepia, however, felt a rush of excitement and decided to deal with them on her own, but Dio stopped her and said there was no need to rush. He explained to her that before making any moves, they needed to familiarize themselves with the map. Dio knew that in Nadfanta, there was no difference between high-level and low-level players in their ability to read maps, and that if you were skilled at it, your level would increase. Now that Dio was with Sepia, he had to use a different tactic than when fighting alone. He began to think about how they should proceed and what further actions they should take. After thinking, he told Sepia to deal with the troops on the roof and explained that there were no more than 3 fighters she might encounter. He then warned her that she would need to run if she felt she was surrounded. Sepia said she did not want to run away but promised to be careful. Dio thought he had been too confident but then felt relieved, for pride brings ruin even to the strong. And so it was decided that Sepia would take care of security while Dio would take care of the rest. Sepia drew her bow and expressed her readiness for the upcoming battle. And when the right moment came, Dio gave the order to begin. Sepia did as she was told and aimed her first arrow straight at the orc's head on the roof. When the arrow reached its target, they both rushed forward to continue their attack. With words and deeds, they began to defeat all the orcs, sending them to the afterlife one by one. And all the lifeless orcs were defeated by Sepia. Dio handed something to Sepia and noted that she had done well. Dio examined her and noted that Sepia had not suffered any injuries and had improved her skills. Calling up the status window, Dio looked at his own status and Sepia's, whose class was still hidden. Dio was disappointed because if he knew Sepia's class, he could have gotten her the right equipment. He understood that although the crystal bow was a powerful weapon, it could not defeat orcs in one shot. Sepia reminded Dio of the witch, whom Dio had probably forgotten while thinking about Sepia. Sepia asked him if they should talk to the witch after what they had done here. But Dio didn't think so because he believed that the Shadow Witch would probably be very angry with them. However, Dio told Sepia that he had a pretty good trick up his sleeve that would be useful to them. He said he believed they would definitely be able to avoid a fight. But just in case, Dio told Sepia not to relax under any circumstances. Sepia, at that moment, was curious about who had raised Dio, because she thought to herself that he had grown up to be a tough nut to crack. Then the system reported that they had discovered an orc cave in the Hafner Valley. Sepia noted the absolute silence in this place and thought that it was because all the orcs had stayed outside. Dio said that there must be another orc shaman in this cave, but they couldn't let him die because this was the witch's experiment. They had killed all of the Shadow Witch's orcs, and if they did the same to the orc shaman, their conversation with the witch would be very serious. Dio then said that they needed to bypass the orc shaman and head straight to the Shadow Witch's laboratory. Dio looked around and said that they were already close because, according to his memory, the laboratory was already somewhere nearby. Then he finally found a shortcut that would lead them straight to the Shadow Witch's laboratory. When this entrance was first discovered, there was some debate as to whether it was a bug or a design flaw, but it was ultimately concluded that it was a special feature. Sepia then thought that Dio had been here before, and Dio agreed with her. Crawling through the small, narrow passage, he told Sepia that it was time to move on. The path was not long, and they finally found themselves in the Shadow Witch's laboratory. Dio immediately asked the witch if she could hear him, but she only responded with a sarcastic giggle. Then she laughed loudly, making it clear to our heroes that they had come to the right place. She addressed them as if they were her future meal, hinting that she needed enough food to last her for the next 6 months. Dio replied that he was surprised to hear that she was still capable of fighting for food. She turned to Dio saying that orc heads were worth a lot and that he would have to answer for each one. Then she flew into a rage, intending to accept payment in the lives of our heroes. Dio pushed Sepia behind him because the situation was starting to get pretty serious. Then Dio took out a bag and showed it to the Shadow Witch. The witch froze for a moment, as if she understood what was inside the bag. Then Dio greeted her and introduced himself as a doctor who had come to her from the Eastern Sea. He poured out the many coins that were in the bag, saying that he knew the witch needed new knowledge and that he had come to ask for her help. But the witch was still angry because Dio and Sepia had killed all her orcs. But Dio apologized, explaining that they simply didn't know that the orcs were her subordinates. Changing the subject, he explained that despite this, he was sure he had something that would please the Shadow Witch. The witch could clearly see that the bag in front of her was filled to the brim with gold. Dio noted that this was very rude of him, and probably not enough to earn the witch's forgiveness. The witch was torn between how many chickens she could buy with that money, and the fact that she didn't need chickens at all. She thought that the path of a witch was always very difficult, but she believed that she should not lose her dignity just because she was hungry. Then she told Dio that if he was planning to buy her, he wouldn't get anywhere. But then Dio said that it was not a bribe, but money he would give her for the lives of her orc subordinates. And then, after these words, he showed her the real gift that Dio had prepared for her. The witch was shocked to see it, for it was the essence of fire, which she knew well. Dio knew that this item was very difficult to obtain, and was very valuable to both players and residents of the game. It was no surprise that Dio's inventory was overflowing with these items. Dio explained that on the eastern continent, this material was used as decoration, and the witch was shocked by this information. But Dio said he could provide her with as many of these items as she needed. She was completely shocked, and then invited the guests to sit down for further conversation. After calming down, she introduced herself as Evelina Lapis, a student of the Witch of Balance, and asked them not to be shy, and to call her simply Evelina. Dio introduced himself again as Dio, and began to introduce his companion Sepia, but she interrupted him and introduced herself. But Evelyn had heard that name before and had heard about her as a child, and Sepia was surprised that the witch knew her. The witch knew that Sepia had been born with the power of the sun and asked our heroes about it. Dio also did not understand where the witch had gotten this information, and wondered if Ludens could have told her about it. But then he realized that the witch Evelyn was probably a member of the Church of the Sun herself. The witch told her guests not to worry about it, as she had learned this information from her teacher. The witch said that her teacher was one of the 7 stars of Walpurgis Night, and the same could be said of Ludens. But Dio had never heard of this before and asked Evelyn to explain it to him in more detail. Evelyn thought for a moment and then said that she had to explain to both of them what it really meant. But at some point she fell silent and Dio looked at the fiery entity. He gave the first entity to Evelyn, and she was happy but worried about possible problems that might arise. But she quickly pulled herself together and continued her story to her guests. She began to tell them that on Walpurgis Night, there was a secret meeting of 7 stars who had united with one common goal. These were the 7 most influential stars that worship the sun. She said that her teacher and Ludens were among these stars. Dio knew that all 5 cult bosses in the game were called pentagrams, and it turned out that they were all separate entities. He realized that even though the power of the sun had been forgotten, its traces were hidden throughout the continent, and the mission of the 7 stars was to find it. In other words, she explained that Walpurgis Night was created for the exchange of information, but Dio did not understand what they intended to do with the traces. Unfortunately for Dio, Evelyn knew nothing about this. She only said that, according to her teacher, the power of the sun they had found would help restore order to their world. Dio realized that a world ruled by the moon was a real cataclysm that turned the game world upside down. Dio didn't think much about it and realized that the game system was leading him along the path of the sun, where 7 stars would come to his aid. Until recently, the outcome of the struggle with the Church of the Moon was completely unclear, but the Witch of Balance was on the same side. Dio then realized that it was possible to defeat the Church of the Moon if all 7 stars were entities of the pentagram. Dio asked if there were other witches who believed in the power of the sun. But the witch Evelyn did not know the exact answer to this question because the topic of the power of the sun is not discussed even among witches. However, she said that her teacher's witches had devoted themselves entirely to studying the power of the sun. Then Dio realized that this was the reason why there were so many entries related to fire in the scientific journal, and the same applied to the essence of flame. When Dio asked what exactly they were researching, the witch replied that they were mainly studying the restoration of the forgotten power of the sun. Dio noticed that Evelina was probably unhappy about helping her teacher research this question. Of course, she was unhappy because, at 26 years old, she was trying to find a power that had existed thousands of years ago. She shouted that she would definitely show what she was capable of, and that the only reason she cared about the orcs was because of this research. Dio found it amusing how loud the witch Evelyn was, since he couldn't even stop her. She reminded him of a colleague from work who also always complained about his boss. Sepia pointed out that Ms. Evelyn's teacher probably still trusted her. Sepia's words struck Evelyn, and she looked at her in a completely different light. She rushed into Sepia's arms because Sepia had noticed that Evelyn was the most hard-working shadow witch and said that Sepia was an amazing person. Then Dio said that despite all this, he and Sepia had come to this place for a reason. He said he intended to ask the witch to reveal Sepia's power. Evelyn looked at her but did not yet understand what she could do with this power. She took her hands and tried to sense something using her power. She asked about Sepia's power, and Sepia replied that it only manifested when she was in danger. She also said that when her power manifested, she always lost consciousness for reasons unknown to her. Hearing this, the witch Evelina said that Sepia's power was much stronger than she could have imagined. Summing up, she said that at the moment she could not help Sepia learn to control her power. Dio was extremely upset because his suspicions had been confirmed, and he realized that there was probably nothing more he could do about it. But the witch said that just because she couldn't help Sepia control her power, didn't mean that Sepia couldn't control her rage. Dio was intrigued by this idea and asked her to explain it in more detail. She said that she used her shadow to awaken another consciousness. She explained that it wasn't just a shadow that simply followed her, but rather another consciousness that thought and acted independently. In other words, Evelyn compared her shadow to a completely different personality. She said that Sepia would no longer lose consciousness because her shadow would allow her to gain another self-awareness. But Dio was worried because it sounded extremely dangerous, and he thought that a completely different Sepia would appear. But she reassured him, saying that there are many personalities inside a person, and that all they needed to do was awaken one of them. Dio thought about it because everything seemed more complicated than he had thought, but he and Sepia had no other choice. Everything would be much easier and better if Sepia could use her power while in her consciousness. But the thing was that Sepia didn't know how to use magic, so she couldn't even practice while conscious. And she has no way of learning magic from witches because she cannot control her power. Then Evelyn said that magic is present in every person, but if you don't have talent, nothing will work no matter how hard you try. Sepia then asked Evelyn to teach her, because no one knows if she has a talent for certain abilities. And from that day on, everything changed dramatically because Sepia developed a strong desire to learn. Evelyn agreed to meet them halfway and began teaching Sepia magic. After some time, Sepia still couldn't feel anything, but Evelyn said there was no reason to be discouraged, because for many people, this is how it happens the first time. Evelyn said that even if Sepia couldn't feel her mana yet, she would still be able to use magic. Dio joined them and asked the witch if things would get better with her help. The witch said that there was one long way to feel mana, but it would take months, and they definitely didn't have that much time, so Sepia became sad. When Dio realized that all these attempts were simply pointless, he suggested that Sepia move on and continue their journey. But Sepia didn't give up and tried again, and something definitely came of it. Both Dio and the witch Evelyn watched in amazement, their mouths agape. For Evelyn, it was a disaster because her laboratory was engulfed in flames. To extinguish her burning laboratory, Evelyn used a water cell spell. By dousing Sepia with water, she was able to stop the fire from spreading. Evelyn didn't understand how Sepia was able to use magic without feeling her mana. Evelyn began to get nervous, trying to understand why Sepia couldn't feel anything, but Sepia said she felt warmth. But Evelyn shouted that this small amount of heat could have easily burned everything around them if she hadn't stopped her in time. Finally, Evelyn realized that this was the power of the ego she had only heard about. She told Dio that this power could be easily learned. She explained to Sepia that even without feeling mana and knowing the theory, it was possible to use any magic. Then Dio realized that Sepia's abilities were nothing like those in games. Dio realized that in order to use his power, he needed to increase his level. Dio asked Evelyn how long it would take to learn all the magic. She couldn't answer that question precisely because it was highly individual, but it had taken her 6 months to learn the basics. Dio was surprised by this time frame, but Evelyn explained that it was actually quite fast. He told her that he couldn't leave Sepia, but they didn't have that kind of time to spare. She said that wasn't a problem because Sepia always followed him. She was referring to the research they were conducting there, but Dio still didn't understand what Evelyn meant. She hinted that she was ready to go with them because there was a person here who possessed the power of the sun. But to Dio, this statement didn't sound very convincing. But thinking about the fact that Evelyn was a student of the Witch of Balance, he realized that her company would not hinder them in any way. She hugged Sepia tightly and promised that she would not interfere with their journey, only occasionally making her notes. Dio was curious about Sepia's opinion on the matter, so he asked her to find out what she thought. She bowed to Evelyn and politely asked her to take care of her. Hearing Sepia address her as a teacher, she was shocked. Meanwhile, a meeting was taking place to discuss Ludens' behavior and the suspicion that he had simply gone mad. Ludens was then asked why he had not raised the issue that interested him at their last meeting. Ludens was asked to reveal the whereabouts of the guy who had told him about his power. Ludens then said that he had sent a man named Dio to Estelrum. Some say that it would be unthinkable to take his life as only 1,000 years had passed. When one of them was asked to calm down, he couldn't do it because it was almost midnight, and their comrade Palkido had not yet returned. Then one of them rose from the table and addressed the others, saying that the guy might be the key to gaining the power of the sun. Enraged by this, she couldn't believe what she had been told, that those people had been brought to the cemetery. But she was immediately calmed down and told that if she was determined to fight, she would be better off abandoning her intentions. She was then reminded that it was forbidden to fight among members of the Seven Stars Assembly. After calming down a little, she was told that the son of that man was very different from their son, and therefore he intended to go to Estelrum. Meanwhile, our heroes managed to reach a place called Estunia. The witch Evelyn was enchanted by the snowflakes falling on her palm. She explained her joy by saying that she had never before traveled beyond the west, and had therefore never seen snow in her life. The witch warned her companions that witches rarely wander in these parts, and that if they are not careful, they could simply burn up. Dio realized that if they encountered the Inquisitor, there would be no mercy, and the only witch who could be here was Evelyn's teacher. Sepia, worried about Dio, asked if he was cold, and he replied that he could endure it. Dio found a place that was perfect for sheltering from the wind, and suggested setting up camp there. Sepia wanted to help light the fire herself. As she said, Sepia did it with ease. Evelyn was delighted with her student's success, while Sepia herself noted that she still had a lot to learn from her. Dio also couldn't help but notice that Sepia had become much stronger in the 2 weeks she had spent with Evelyn. Dio also thought that Evelyn was acting foolishly because she was bluffing, but as it turned out, she was simply a genius. Dio kept thinking about the task given to him by the system to find followers who had survived from ancient times to the present day. Meanwhile, the girls from his group were sleeping peacefully in their sleeping bags and dreaming. Dio began to think about his friend Ludens in Estelrum, who might also be forgotten by the sun god, or that he might be one of the 7 stars. He understood that this man could be anyone, just like a simple inhabitant of the game. Dio had no way of knowing without meeting him in person. In any case, he did have one joyful thing that he was able to find in this cave. It was an elixir that could restore the characteristics that had declined after signing the contract with Sepia. Dio turned around and saw Sepia, who had already woken up. Before she could open her eyes, she asked Dio if he was going somewhere. At that moment, Evelyn also woke up, and Dio told her that he had gone deep into the cave. Evelyn said that he could have done everything with magic, but Dio said that one should not always rely on magic, but Evelyn believed that only those who did not know how to use it properly said that. When Sepia said that Dio was skilled at magic, Evelyn became curious as to why he couldn't become her teacher. But the thing was that Dio simply always used the skill window to learn. Evelyn couldn't believe her eyes when she saw this because she didn't know that these windows could be summoned without the help of artifacts. Dio explained that it was all simple magic of 1s and 0s. Finally, after rummaging through his inventory, Dio found what he had been looking for. Without thinking twice, he gave the items he found to Sepia, but she didn't understand what they were. He told Sepia that they would arrive in Estelrum tomorrow, but Sepia still couldn't understand what Dio was trying to tell her. Then he finally told her that they were arrows made of the highest quality silver that could be useful to her. It wasn't long before our heroes found themselves in Estelrum, a city with Romanian motifs. And it was not surprising that various vampires could appear here. Dio asked Evelyn, thinking that all vampires believed in the sun, but she replied that unlike witches, vampires could believe in other things. Now Evelyn was curious to know if those who were not under Ludens' influence could turn out to be bad guys. When Dio told her that witches weren't always white and fluffy either, she replied that witches never harm people. But Dio immediately reminded her of the witches' attack on the farmers. Leaving all that aside, Dio asked if they could consider all witches their allies. Evelyn was curious why Dio needed so much silver, and Dio was surprised that Evelyn didn't know. Dio then explained that vampires could be killed with a single blow from high-quality silver, but he thought that this might also apply to witches. When they reached the gates of Estelrum, Dio was surprised to see a cemetery right next to the entrance. Before they could enter, Dio asked Evelyn to disguise them because there might be followers of the moon who could recognize them. Evelyn gladly agreed to do so, taking her magic wand in her hands. In less than a second, Dio and Sepia looked like brother and sister with the same hair color, but Dio told Sepia to put on a hood for extra safety. First, they decided to find a place to stay and fortify themselves with some local food. They enjoyed the delicious food, and Evelyn noted that there were a lot of pieces of meat in the soup she ate. After lunch, it was time to discuss their next steps. Dio continued to eat, and at the same time said that they needed to come up with new names so that the Church of the Moon would not recognize them. He told Evelyn that it wasn't necessary to tell everyone that she was a witch. He gave her the mercenary's sign and suggested gathering some information. Evelyn thought it would be an interesting experience, but Sepia was worried that they would have to take requests. Dio said that it would be an excellent plan to blend into the Estelrum system. But then, at the place where our heroes were having lunch, some people came in and started actively discussing some news. They were discussing the Inquisitor who had turned River North upside down, and our heroes listened intently to every word. Then they started discussing the powerful knight there, referring to Sigmund. And Sepia, hearing rumors that the Inquisitor had taken Sigmund with her, was simply speechless. Those people continued to discuss how the Inquisitor was still searching for everyone involved in the case, and they were curious how much they would be paid. Feeling that there was no longer any need to listen to them, he suggested that Sepia move on. Dio then thought that if Sigmund had failed to stop the Church of the Moon, perhaps he could succeed. The witch walking behind Dio asked if she understood correctly that Dio was putting himself in danger because of Ludens's words. Dio agreed with her as he himself did not know whether he could trust him, since the demons themselves had caused such a commotion. Evelyn said that in that case, there must be an objective reason for the 7 stars, and Dio thought that he should increase the difficulty. Evelyn, however, thought that Dio sometimes said things that were extremely absurd and incomprehensible to her. Then our heroes arrived at the meeting place for mercenaries in Estelrum, where they were greeted politely. Dio said they had come to register and they were sent on their way. The man said that they needed to touch a crystal ball to determine their rank and state their name. Dio decided to introduce himself by choosing the name Leo for future use. Sepia's rank was under the letter D and Evelyn's rank was under the letter C. After registering, the man suggested they look at the wall where they could see requests. They approached the wall and saw many names to choose from, ranging from vampires to pigeons. Dio thought about it and decided that they should take all the names except for hunting. When the girls saw the number of names, a notification came from the system that they needed to bring 2 vampire fangs to the guild leader. When the task was received, Leo said that he needed to step away for a moment, and that they should empty all the lists while he was gone. Sepia was unhappy because Dio had started doing the same thing that upset her again. But Sepia understood perfectly well that Dio clearly had a plan, and she reassured herself with this thought. Dio decided that there was absolutely no point in collecting vampire fangs one by one. Dio didn't really need to look for any fangs because he had plenty of similar things in his arsenal. When the girls picked up all the requests, everyone looked at them in surprise. They even laughed because they knew it was impossible to fulfill so many requests at once, despite their rank. As one option, he suggested leaving a few for the other mercenaries who were now left with no tasks at all. But Evelyn said that the man was absolutely right, but Sepia said that they couldn't give them all the requests. Sepia whispered to Evelyn that when Dio returned, he would definitely fix the situation. When the man grew tired of arguing with the girls, he said that to resolve their conflict, he would simply call security. At that moment, someone in the crowd shouted at him to wait a little longer. It was Dio under the name Leo who appeared just in time. He threw a bag on the table right in front of the man, but the man looked at it cautiously, not understanding what was inside. It turned out that the bag contained everything that was in the requests, pointing to the sheets of paper the girls were holding in their hands. Then he said that he had been able to complete all the tasks without wasting a single day. The man looked at the jewels in the bag with interest and thought about it for a moment. When Dio, under the name Leo, asked the man how long it would take to process all the requests, the man became furious. The man simply did not know how to respond to Dio, as this was the first time such a situation had occurred. The man suggested that Leo take a break and wait, escorting him to the spot. The girls, watching everything that was happening, were happy that everything had ended well. When they received their reward for all the requests they had completed, Evelyn was delighted, comparing the money to the food she could buy with it. Then Dio told Evelyn that she could take as much money as she wanted. Dio didn't need the money because all he wanted was to gain boring experience. Of course, the fact that our heroes took all the existing requests caused a wave of negativity from the other mercenaries. Dio understood that they had attracted a lot of attention, and now there was no need to worry about their identities being revealed. He also understood that there was not a single mercenary who could reveal Evelyn's identity and sense her 150th level magic. Sepia noticed that Dio had bought himself a new sword, and Dio confirmed this. He explained that his old sword had made him easily recognizable, so it was worth replacing his weapon. But it was good that his new sword was made of pure silver. Evelyn, clearly delighted, suggested that Sepia go shopping with her. Sepia was definitely interested, but she was worried that sunset was almost upon them. But Evelyn thought that there was no time to waste. And so, at Evelyn's suggestion, the two of them went shopping. But then Dio stopped them, reminding them that no one had given them permission to leave. When asked why they weren't allowed to go, Dio replied that it was because night was falling. Evelyn shouted that they were no longer children to be told what to do. But then he brought out the big guns and said that if Evelyn didn't obey, he would have to take all the money back. And so they all returned to their room where they had stopped for the night. Dio thought about a cafe nearby that sold frog kebabs where he planned to take the girls in the morning. He compared their behavior to that of schoolgirls who had gone on a trip, but suddenly someone came to the motel where they were staying, certain that they were there. These people were angry because Dio and his team had taken a huge reward for completing their requests. These people intended to rob them without even remembering the names of our heroes. They knew that a girl was staying in room number 4 and that Dio was staying in room number 3. They were then ordered to break into these rooms simultaneously, leaving none of them a chance to survive. Some of them understood that these actions were quite despicable, but they saw no other way out and did not consider it. One of them said that if they didn't do it, the girls would start screaming, making unnecessary noise throughout the motel. And so, when they entered, there were about 10 seconds left before their simultaneous attack. But unfortunately for them, the criminals who were planning to attack were discovered before the 10 seconds had elapsed. It turned out that these scoundrels had been confidently met by Mr. Dio. It didn't take long for him to defeat each of the attackers. Dio called out to the girls in his group who were in the next room, trying to find out if they were all right. But, full of energy and excitement, the witch Evelyn shouted that everything had gone perfectly and that she and Sepia were fine. She was curious about who these people were and was glad that they had not slept all night. Otherwise, everything could have ended badly. Dio explained that these people were thieves and scum of society who simply wanted to take their hard-earned money and kill them. When Dio said that they couldn't relax, Evelyn replied that she couldn't detect anyone nearby using her navigation magic. Then Dio sensed that someone was heading toward them, and that this person had probably smelled the blood of those scoundrels and had come for that reason. He knew exactly who the smell could have attracted, as only vampires and werewolves were attracted to such a scent. But it turned out that the man who had met them in the mercenary shop was standing in front of them. And then Dio realized that he was a vampire hiding among humans. The man said he had come to ask them for a favor. He introduced himself as Robert, noting that his companions had probably already guessed that he was a vampire hiding among humans. Dio became curious about what he might want from them, and asked him to state the essence of his request. Robert explained that he was talking about his master whom he served. His master was a vampire who had decided to live among humans, and his unbreakable rule was to never harm humans. That was why they felt a thirst for blood at midnight, but he explained that they had special reserves for this purpose, which they obtained from the Bureau. He said that they also collect blood from lifeless bodies, which is why he came here, but he also discovered something interesting for himself. Sepia thought about his words and became curious about what he might have found special and interesting. Pointing at Dio, Robert said that his blood seemed extremely special to him and very different from others, and that was why Robert asked him for a favor related to him. He asked him to take a little of Dio's blood and thus help his master. But immediately after that, Robert was bound by a magical rope, and he did not understand why someone would suddenly treat him this way. But then Evelyn intervened, saying that she didn't believe a word he said because she had never heard of vampires living side by side with humans. He fell to the floor and tearfully begged for help, saying he couldn't return to his master empty-handed. Then Dio asked the girls to leave, leaving them alone with Robert. When the girls left, he asked Robert to tell him more about his vampire master. But Robert said he couldn't give him that information, but he could arrange a private meeting if Dio gave him his blood. But for Evelyn, this decision was completely unthinkable, because that would mean they would be walking into the bloodsucker's lair on their own. Evelyn scolded Dio for trusting this vampire, but Dio thought at that moment that he was not an ordinary person either. Dio reasoned that if Robert had a master, then he must be a lord who could also be one of the 7 stars. Dio decided to seize the moment and go to him under the pretext of wanting to share their blood with him. So Dio began to ask Robert about the location of his master and the possible dangers that might arise. It turned out that he was in a camp in the middle of the Cala forest, and for safety reasons, Robert offered to accompany them. Robert was surprised when Dio asked him to take them there immediately so as not to waste time. Then Dio changed his mind and said he would let him know as soon as he and his 2 companions were ready to set off. Dio then told the girls that werewolves and vampires lived in that forest, and that was why he couldn't say it was safe. However, he also noted that the camp in the center that Robert had mentioned was very different from those places. After all, the monsters had made this place a peaceful place where no quarrels were allowed, and that was truly impressive. Sepia became curious as to why Dio refused to go there right away and put it off until later. Dio gave Evelyn a wizard's robe that had a unique rank and a level cap of 150. Dio noted that this robe was much better than the one she had worn before. For Sepia, he prepared an amulet of emptiness that could nullify the effect of any attack capable of taking a person's life. Dio told Sepia that this item was her personal talisman, so she must keep it with her at all times. The Kale Forest is a hunting ground inhabited by vampires, werewolves, and all kinds of monsters that were once human. They accidentally became vampires or werewolves and fled to the forest as if someone were chasing them. However, the two different races could not coexist peacefully in the same place, and eventually their conflict led to them destroying each other. Then, after a central camp was established, all species were saved. Finally, our heroes arrived at the location and Robert said that his master was there. Dio looked at Robert's master and couldn't believe his eyes. Robert's master greeted them, reminding them that a special bloodline was supposed to come to him. Then he said that he never could have imagined that such a special guest would come to him. He ordered his servant to bring him and his guest some delicious tea. Dio thought about his words regarding the valuable guest and thought that perhaps that man had recognized Sepia. He glanced at Evelyn and noted that it was very nice to see familiar faces. Evelyn was delighted to see her familiar master, Shuvald. He noted that she had grown much taller since their last meeting and asked about her teacher's health, to which she replied that everything was fine. At that moment, Dio thought that he must surely be one of the 7 stars, since he knew her teacher. When they had settled comfortably in their chairs, the Lord deigned to introduce himself. He introduced himself as Shuvald Einhauer, and noted that Ludens had introduced Sepia and Dio to him before they had met in person. Seeing Sepia's silver hair and golden hair, Shuvald remarked that she looked very much like that person. Dio joined the conversation and asked if he understood correctly that Shuvald was one of the 7 stars. But Shuvald replied that he understood Dio's caution perfectly well. Dio apologized for his rudeness, explaining that Ludens had put them in danger and that they were now forced to be cautious. At that moment, Dio was not sure if he could consider the 7 stars his allies, as it was possible that they were using them. Dio asked Shuvald to tell him how he had obtained the power of the Forgotten Swordsman. For Shuvalda, this was not difficult at all, but there was one catch. He said that before giving Dio the information, he wanted to check that the key he had was correct. Dio did not yet understand what exactly Shuvald wanted to see, and he suggested that he should demonstrate the power of the Forgotten Swordsman in action. Shuvald said that the power of the Forgotten Swordsman that he had received was not the true power of the sun. But Dio didn't understand what Shuvald meant by this and didn't really understand what kind of power he was talking about. Shuvald, without saying a word to Dio, struck the stone with his fist, clenching his fist. But Dio still didn't quite understand why Shuvald was demonstrating his power to him. Dio thought that this could be easily done if one possessed the martial arts skills of the 300th level, since he was one of the 7 stars. Then Shuvald asked Dio to come closer and see something with his own eyes. When Dio approached the stone, it shattered into tiny pieces in an instant. Remaining completely calm, Shuvald said that this was the power of the sun and asked Dio if he could repeat it. When Dio replied that he did not know how to do such a thing, Shuvald offered to teach him this power and show him how to use it. Dio immediately began asking questions to clarify whether he would be able to repeat the same thing if he studied under Shuvald. Shuvald replied that he could only learn this power if he had the key to it. Dio did not understand what key he meant and wondered if it could be related to what he had received from the knight Adeli Dark. Then he told Shuvald that he had no time to think about it and asked him to teach him how to use the power. Shuvald looked approvingly at these words, noting that Dio was definitely thinking correctly. But before beginning their training, Shuvald wanted to ask Dio something, and he immediately understood that it was about his blood. Shuvald said that the curse had affected him more than the others, so when midnight came, he would fall into a rage and lose control of himself. Dio at that moment thought that it all sounded quite unusual, calmly sipping his fragrant tea. Dio said that no matter what, he and Sepia would stay there while Dio learned his powers, but Evelyn shouted that he had forgotten to mention her. Shuvald reminded the Shadow Witch Evelyn that she had her own teacher, and she replied that she also believed in the sun. And then they decided that today they should all get a good rest and start their training the next day. When it was time for dinner, Evelyn was extremely disappointed. She was surprised to see only vegetables and greens in front of her, and Robert said that she could skip dinner if she didn't like it. In response, she indignantly told Robert that she had lost a lot of blood and needed to replenish her reserves. Hearing Evelyn's words, Shuvald noted that perhaps the food really did seem terrible. She immediately realized that she had said something stupid and thanked Schwalb for the food, and Dio noted that she was quickly fitting into society. But he also understood that it was foolish to expect different food from them, since they were vegetarian vampires, and perhaps that was why he was going crazy. When morning came, Schwalb asked Dio to show him all his skills so that he could understand what he was dealing with. Finally, Dio understood what was required of him on the first try and took the weapon in his hands. And so Dio began to perform various techniques, demonstrating his strength from all sides. Shuvald watched Dio's every move very closely. Finally, Dio ended his performance with a powerful explosion. Even the Shadow Witch Evelyn was amazed by what she saw. After finishing, Dio explained that they had now seen the limit of his abilities. Shuvald said that he even missed this sword technique, as it belonged to Adelia Dark. Shuvald spoke of her as a strong and graceful paladin, who was not afraid to take the initiative and was also a shield and sword of the sun. Dio continued Shuvald's thought, saying that Dark was also cursed and then turned into a monster knight, Shuvald added that this was precisely why no one had been able to find her. He admitted that, unfortunately, he did not know how to use a sword and was a monk, so he could not help him in this matter. However, he said that if Dio learned Adelia's sword style, he would definitely be able to use the power of the sun. He explained that mana is determined by ability, not the power of the sun, but that he could become strong regardless of his individual abilities. The Shadow Witch Evelyn then asked a logical question about the reasons for such conclusions. Shuvald explained that the power of the sun is present wherever there is light. He explained that the sun's energy is not only available from bodies, but can also be used by taking it from outside using the surrounding light. He demonstrated how the power absorbed from outside can be released and used. Dio, watching all this, realized that it was incomparable to the explosions he was capable of. Dio was surprised at how easily Shuvald spoke of this, but he replied that he would definitely teach Dio if he didn't succeed the first time. Dio was extremely serious because he understood that it would be difficult, but he had to obtain the power of the sun at any cost. Shuvald began the serious training only 3 days later. He told Dio that he needed to start with meditation, but for some reason he was very bad at it. He said that it was best to meditate in the sunlight because that way you could feel the power of the sun better. Dio had no other choice, so he kept trying and tried very hard. Then Sepia appeared in view, dragging the Shadow Witch Evelyn behind her. Evelyn was amazed at how strong Sepia was, and she replied that it was all thanks to Dio, who made her do physical training. Dio gave the girls a mission to kill the forest monster and asked them about their results so far. Sepia held out her hand and showed Dio her palm, which had 2 fangs. The witch said that she had almost lost her life because Shuvald had taken away her shadow magic. But Sepia, addressing Evelyn as her mentor, said that she had only been able to defeat the monster thanks to her. Dio understood that Shuvald had been forced to limit Evelyn's power for the sake of her training in the power of the sun. Shuvald taught them to believe that the power of the sun is always nearby, even when the sunlight is hidden by the treetops. Dio knew that there were monsters of level 140 in this place, which even Evelyn, who was level 150, would find difficult to defeat. And then he thought that perhaps there was no danger because Mr. Shuvald would be able to protect them. Sepia was curious if her friend Dio had made any progress in his diligent attempts to master the power of the sun. Shuvald said that his advanced technique also required the power of the sun, and if he tried to understand its principle, he would be able to comprehend everything. For Dio, the only thing that was completely incomprehensible and strange was that he had to use the power of the sun without any help from the system. Dio opened the status window and realized that despite drinking the potion and using the advanced technique all night long, he couldn't feel anything. It was lunchtime and our heroes gathered together again. Evelyn Robert thought that there was a black hole in her stomach because she was eating so actively. Dio, looking at them, noted that not a single day had passed in this place without them arguing. Shuvald made a remark to Robert and reminded him that they all believed in the sun and asked him to be more friendly so that they could walk this path together. Robert listened to his master and said he would definitely try to do so. Then Dio had another thought and became curious as to why Shuvald worked as a herbalist. The other 7 stars were increasing their power, for example, Ludens, the leader of the Golden Dawn, and the Witch of Balance who ruled over the other witches. Shuvald said that he used to have many allies, but in order to bring back the sun, he had to make wise choices. And then Dio realized that all this was a necessary measure due to the strong thirst for blood caused by the curse. The thing is, when darkness falls, vampires and werewolves lose control of themselves, but Dio was sure that Shuvald could control himself. Shuvald told him that before the curse, he was a monk and practiced penance, renouncing greed and purifying his mind. And it was at that moment that he learned the principle of not harming others, and so he decided to live away from people in order not to violate his principles. Dio realized that due to the situation, Shuvald had no way of creating a group of followers. When Dio asked him to tell him about the events of the past, Shuvald reminded him that he would do so after he had learned the power of the sun. Dio was extremely upset because he could not feel this power that he had never had. Then Shuvald told Dio that he already possessed a great deal of information. Dio was surprised when Shuvald said that his thoughts were confused only because he knew too much. He suggested that he look at Sepia and analyze some aspects of her. He said that she was able to learn quickly because she was like a blank slate and knew nothing. She then said that the previous day she had definitely felt something very warm. Dio, with warmth in his heart, thought that if things continued in the same vein, Sepia would definitely surpass him. Then Shuvald intended to tell Dio the reason why he started his training with meditation. To help Dio understand, he asked him to recall how their conversation had begun. Returning to the beginning, he reminded Dio that he meant too much, and that was the whole secret. Shuvald was right because Dio's head had been full of thoughts since the beginning of the game. Then he sat down in a meditation pose and decided to try again to clear his mind, at least for a minute. Meanwhile, in the northern region, an inquisitor named Galetto Houndatu was relaxing in a tavern. He was happy that he had been sent to the north because this was where they made the most delicious drinks. Out of the corner of his ear, he heard other patrons discussing him. They were discussing that they hadn't seen Mr. Jaffe and Gordon lately, and that they had probably chosen the wrong target. They discussed the limits of their power, for they possessed a level of strength that bordered on madness. But that man suddenly turned around and addressed them, drawing their attention. He asked about the guy they were talking about and where he was. Returning to our heroes, Sepia saw something terrible. She shouted at Dio to turn around and pay attention to the attacking monsters coming his way. Dio immediately got up from the ground, replaying Shuvalda's words in his head about how he knew too much. Preparing for the upcoming battle, he thought it would be great to have power he could use without the help of the system. On the monsters that were approaching, he used a technique called dissection. But for some reason, the technique didn't work. He decided to try again and imagined the energy of the sun as Shuvald saw it. The monster began to attack even more fiercely, and Dio thought that with his power, he could easily cut off its claws. When the monster surrounded Dio, Evelyn offered to help him, as she thought he was in great pain. But Sepia replied that at that moment they must believe in Dio with all their hearts, and then he would surely prevail. After countless failed attempts, Dio ran out of breath and asked the monsters aloud to slow down. He tried to push away all the knowledge from the pop-up windows of the system, and try to use the power of the sun. Remembering that he needed to meditate under the sun, Dio immediately ran and stood under its rays. Finally, he succeeded and felt the long-awaited power of the sun. Excited, he looked at his reflection in his weapon and decided to try again. And sure enough, Dio's next attack was a complete success. The girls watching from the sidelines couldn't stop admiring what they were seeing. Then everything went completely off-plan and Evelyn saw that Dio had dropped his weapon on the ground. But the energy continued to flow and Dio realized that this was no problem. Without wasting any time, he continued the fight using only his fists. And finally, as the final stage, he snapped his fingers and ended the fight with an explosion. It was an enchanting show and everyone watched in amazement. They were shocked because they had seen the power of the sun that Mr. Shuvald had used. Immediately, the system reported that Sepia's faith level had increased to 8, and the hidden condition of the forgotten sword art had been unlocked. Dio looked at the status window with relief because now he could awaken the power of the sun within himself. Dio tensed when he saw that only one of the two conditions had been met, and he didn't understand what he hadn't done yet. But then Sepia and Evelyn shouted at him in extreme joy. Dio understood that Sepia was worried about him, but at the same time, she believed in him very much. Dio looked at them and asked about the results of their training. Suddenly, Dio felt a sharp pain in his heart and didn't understand where it could have come from. His heart was contracting, and he thought it might be a side effect of using the power of the sun. Then he simply collapsed to the ground in pain, causing the girls to worry.